Hogwarts Legacy is a game for which I have been greatly excited, and judging by the sales numbers, it looks like many of you were excited as well. And overall, I would say that the game is really good, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my time with it, though I do have a handful of complaints and things that I would change if I were working on the sequel. To quickly describe my thoughts, I would say that this game is a solid 8 out of 10. It's good, not great. The open world is highly repetitive, and the only means of encouraging exploration employed here, beyond just keen interest and curiosity in the world, is the god-awful loot and gear system, a system that's so utterly lackluster that it could have probably been cut from the game entirely, and the game as a whole wouldn't suffer one iota. Furthermore, the story lacks any significant consequence at all, even when the player chooses to use the literal unforgivable curses. Yeah, that's right, you can use the unforgivable curses in front of your professors and teachers, and they don't so much as blink an eye. Characters in general are very hit or miss in terms of memorability, and they often feel as though the writers simply were presupposing that you, the player, would be interested in the stories and personalities present, which sucks because this means that the writers didn't justify the characters in this world by creating compelling characters and giving you, the player, time to get to know them through missions or narrative beats with them. However, all of these frustrations are very quickly overshadowed by the things that the game does remarkably well. It has a surprisingly robust combat system, a truly phenomenal recreation of the wizarding world that many people have dreamed of exploring since they were children, and the open world design is done so well that most players find themselves getting lost within this world, spending hours upon hours mindlessly exploring, something which is actually quite difficult to pull off. To put it simply, it has a lot of good elements, and it also has a handful of bad ones, but when everything is taken into consideration, I would say it balances out to a game that's actually pretty good, and that generally lives up to the hype, which is saying something because this is probably the most hyped the gaming community has been since Elden Ring, which I know was only a year ago, but still, it's extremely hyped. The one caveat with this would be your predisposition towards or against Harry Potter as a franchise. Don't worry, this isn't going to be one of those videos where a YouTuber starts rambling at you about what you should do or think about ethical or moral issues. I'm a gaming YouTuber. Why should you give a crap what I think about this stuff? It's just, you know, if you're interested in hearing me ramble about moral or ethical issues, I mean, I guess it's just not the channel for you. I respect you guys too much to fill these videos with that type of thing. What is important to note, and what I will address here, is simply that while the game, when evaluated in a vacuum, is an 8 out of 10, if you love Harry Potter as a franchise, it probably adds a point or two onto that total for you. This could easily be one of the best games you've ever played if you truly love this franchise and if this is the dream game you've been waiting for since childhood. And I will say, I know for a fact that for a lot of you guys out there, this game is exactly that. It is the childhood dream come true. For a lot of people, when they were kids watching the films and reading the books, they dreamed of the day that they could go to classes, spending time with teachers and students, and perhaps even casting some spells while they're at it. And if you're one such player, you should absolutely enjoy this game more than probably anything else that will be releasing this year, if we're being honest, and possibly even the next couple of years, because it will literally be a dream come true. On the other hand, if you're predisposed towards disliking games in this franchise, maybe you just don't like magical wizarding games, or you don't like magic in video games, or perhaps you just really hate this game's source material's author, in which case you just were never going to like it. It's just not for you. All told, if this game is in fact an 8 out of 10 and you like Harry Potter, it will probably get a point or two added, resulting in a 9 or a 10 out of 10. If you hate Harry Potter as a franchise though, it will probably receive a deduction of points in the realm of 2 to 5 points, possibly more if you're particularly passionate about certain things, leading it down all the way to the point where it's a strong do not buy on the game recommendation spectrum. But my goal in this critique is not to explain to you why you should add 1 or 2 points if you like the franchise, or subtract 2 to 5 points if you hate the franchise. My goal is to break down the game as it is when evaluated in a vacuum. And that's the great thing about evaluating video games critically and skeptically, is that you can see through all of the mist, all of the hype, and the vitriol related to any given title, and you can just look at what it is as it is without any of that extra bloat. Basically, it's up to you to decide whether you want to give this game extra points for being in a franchise you love or to deduct it for various reasons. But what I'm going to do in this critique is argue why, as a video game, this is a good, not great title, but it's still far better than I expected it to be, and then I think a lot of other people thought it would be. This game really is a triumph for this smaller studio that is Avalanche Games. Not the guys that made Mad Max, that's a different studio entirely. These guys' last game was Cars 3 Driven to Win. Before that, they worked on Disney Infinity and all of those games. This is a smaller studio that hasn't gone into the AAA World Series like this, and they went and they didn't quite hit it out of the park, but they did score a triple. You know, like they still did a great job, though it wasn't as great as it could have been. And I know sometimes these videos can seem like I'm just trying to poke holes for the sake of poking holes in games, but I know for a fact that multiple members of Avalanche Software and Portkey Games watch these videos. They've seen the video I did on the 15-second rule of the open world design of Hogwarts Legacy, which is something we're going to talk about in just a little bit. I know that the people that make these games watch these videos. So when we talk about what we would change, what works and what doesn't, they can evaluate what we as the gamers and critics are saying, and they can then take that, possibly make changes to the next game that comes down the pike. Maybe they disagree with what I say and they stick to it, in which case, whatever, they probably have reason for disagreeing with me. But the point is, these videos can actually make a difference, and you never know who's in the comment section with you. So if you have thoughts as we go through this whole game, make sure to vocalize those in the comment section below, because again, you never really know who's going to be down in the comment section. We're going to be looking at the open world design of the game in addition to the story, characters, and pretty much everything else. I'm going to explain how they took a lot of inspiration from Breath of the Wild in a good way, but also missed the point of it when it comes to, say, the gear system and the Merlin trials, which are directly based off of the Korok seed system from that game. We're also going to be looking at the narrative and discussing why some story beats, characters, and consequence decisions hurt this game's immersion. We'll talk about the fun factor, the prospects for a sequel, which I'm sure is going to be coming, and we're even going to look at some spreadsheets that have data collected from a data mine within the game's files so that we can figure out, for example, why the broom feels so much better to use than the super cool mounts that you can unlock, or perhaps why it feels like the game suddenly gets so much easier later on in the game when you've just been leveling up at a steady pace. There's an actual quantifiable statistical reason why that happens, and I'm going to share it with you in this video. I mean, you're probably getting it by now. This is not going to be a rough overview video. This is meant to be a bit of a deep dive. We're going to get specific, and by the end of this, you should have a much greater understanding of how Hogwarts Legacy works, and also why parts of it really don't work. I'll try to argue my points, but I won't pretend as though I'm immune to correction. If you come across something in this video that's factually wrong or that you simply disagree with, please let me know in the comments. As always, I welcome constructive criticism, and I try to correct my positions as new information and perspectives are presented. Nobody will agree with everything I say in this video, including you, so feel free to let me know with what you disagree, and who knows, you might just convince me. As I write this script, I don't know how long this video is going to be when all is said and done, but I would encourage you to use the chapter markers and bounce around the video as you see fit. I've also made this available on all major podcasting platforms so that you can listen on the go if you don't have YouTube Premium. That will of course be linked in my link tree that's in the description. Just pop over there and you can bounce straight to where it's listed on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or you can download it straight from SoundCloud. And I'm sure it goes without saying, but these videos take a ton of time and effort to make. Me and my team work on this stuff for weeks and weeks and weeks. We invest in new servers and stuff. Like, look at this. You wonder what that cable is behind me? It's for a NAS that is transferring all of the footage from my playthroughs of Hogwarts Legacy that's on that server right there that has 48 terabytes of storage, and it's going onto this guy that has 36 terabytes of, no, is that right? 32 terabytes of storage on this, and then I'm going to be driving this to my editor tomorrow so that he can start editing off of this thing because we have so much freaking footage to deal with. As a result, these things are expensive, and it's not just as simple as throwing a video together. So if you are able to financially say thank you with a super thanks comment, which should be working on this channel now, or if you just want to pop over to the live stream, become a member over there, you'll get access to these critiques early before anybody else sees them. You get access to them just for being a member of that live channel, stuff like that. Just anything helps. or don't. I mean, I'm putting this up for free on YouTube, so if you don't have the ability, I'm just glad you're watching and engaging, but I have to e-beg because I'm a YouTuber and that's what we do now. But enough of that garbage. Let's just get right into it and start talking about Hogwarts Legacy. Big shout out to the wiki, where I've collected a handful of images and information on various characters just as a matter of fact checking, so shout out to them. And also a major shout out to this user who posted the most Ravenclaw thing I've ever seen in my life. User Blahable, I don't really know how to say it, but this guy did some phenomenal work and data mined a bunch of stuff out of the game to figure out exact numbers and stats for how multipliers work as you level up through the game. All sorts of really, really specific data that I normally would have to sift through and find myself. He figured this out before me and posted all of these data tables and stuff, which we're going to be going through later and I'll be explaining. So, I mean, this right here basically knocked like 2 weeks off of the production time of this critique. So shout out to this dude doing the Dark Lord's work. I mean, really, props. But okay, really, with all that said, let's get into it. Now, first things first, I think it's important for me to just explain what I mean by skepticism and what my methodology or approach is when I evaluate video games, because I often see people say that I'm being overly skeptical or that I'm being skeptical and that means I'm being overly negative, and they start to conflate cynicism with skepticism. And I just want to be very, very clear on this so that we don't get our wires crossed. If this is overly tedious, feel free to skip ahead, but I think this is important. When I evaluate a video game, I'm basically working off of a spectrum of quality, especially before the game comes out. How this works is that we have just a spectrum, which is a straight line, and it's bookended on either side. If we say this spot over here is really, really good, we'll say this is the threshold for it being awesome. And then when the game comes out, hopefully we are sitting somewhere here in the center. To be clear, we're trying to start in the center, even though some people are going to start in different areas. If you are, say, a hardcore fanboy and you've been hyped up over Hogwarts Legacy, there's no way this game can suck. It's going to be amazing, like the second coming of Dumbledore, okay? You're floating over here. You're already in the green area where this game's awesome. You're sold on it. So you're not starting here in the middle. You're starting over here. And that means that there's gonna have to be a lot that brings you all the way down here where you'll no longer buy the game, where you're not gonna think it's worth engaging with, where you're not gonna commit dozens upon dozens of hours playing it. It's gonna take a lot. And the reason this is a problem is because it means that you will require a heck of a lot more than you probably should in order to change your mind. And this goes the other way too. If you are a hater and you're floating down here in the red, you just started off saying this game's gonna suck, nobody can change my mind, it's gonna take an inordinate amount of information or convincing effectively to bring you all the way to the other side of this spectrum where you might start to actually be positive towards the game. However, if you start in the middle, level-headed, identifying your biases and setting those aside, you're going to be sitting right here on the midpoint. And that means that it doesn't take a ton to bring you over to the positive side, but it also doesn't take a ton to bring you down to the negative. And hopefully over the course of your evaluation of the game, breaking it down, you're going to evaluate all the pieces of evidence pointing for it and against it and land somewhere more reasonable and rational. So how this would work if we were evaluating a game or rating a game in this case, what we're doing is we're starting totally level-headed and we evaluate each piece of the puzzle. So we could say, think of how great the combat system is. That's gonna take us over here a little bit. And then we look at, say, the world building and the creation of this world that's so captivating and interesting. That's probably going to take us even further over here. We're starting to get really, really positive. However, we need to be level-headed with it. From here, we might also evaluate some of the bad stuff. There were a lot of technical issues when Hogwarts Legacy launched. That brings us down a little bit further. And then we evaluate some other things and we say, oh, well, the story lacks all consequence. That means it's really hard to get connected to these characters in a serious way. That brings us back a little bit further. But then we also look at the navigation and the world building, how it encourages that exploration and how fun it is just to go and get lost while you explore the world, and that adds some points. And after we've done this a bunch of times evaluating each piece of the puzzle, we've probably bounced all over and we've ended up hopefully in a spot where we can call it right here. Okay, all the positives. Let's just break each of these down and show how this was a positive because we moved further to the right. And then this was also a positive. This was a positive. This was a positive. This was a positive. This was a positive. Then also show how these are negatives and these are pulling us down. These are negative things that we're evaluating that are changing our perspective and making us think differently. But when we evaluate the whole thing, we start right here, but we end up over here generally very, very positive. That's how I tend to evaluate these things. I try to avoid starting off kilter. I try to avoid starting over here or starting over here so that I have a bias. I try to get rid of that stuff and just evaluate it as a video game and take each piece of the puzzle, each positive and negative chunk of evidence as we go through it that contributes to the argument that this game either rocks or that it sucks. So here I think it's really important that we outline our expectations and what we went into this game looking for and hoping for. For me, let me just say I'm a late bloomer when it comes to my hype surrounding Harry Potter. I grew up in, let's just say, a strict household, so we weren't allowed to watch movies like Harry Potter or certainly read the books because they had magic and that was of Satan. So I only got exposed to this stuff after high school. And once I was exposed to it, I actually fell in love with it. My favorite movies are the later ones because those are clearly more oriented towards older audiences, but they're phenomenal movies. The books are actually very, very well written as far as I can tell. I've only bought the first 3 as like kids books for me to read to Lachlan when he grows up, my son who's just a 1-year-old at this point. But all told, it seems like a really compelling world and I've been pretty into it, even going to Universal Studios and the Wizarding World over there and having a great time there as well. I'm not like a hardcore fan where I'm like wearing robes and crap like that, but I like Harry Potter. I don't love it, but I like Harry Potter. But of course, from the moment that they announced this game, there was a lot of hype surrounding it. It looked to be the open world adventure RPG Harry Potter game that everybody had been wishing for since they were kids. And because I always try to view things in a very skeptical way, I tried to maintain a level head and not buy into the hype because I've been burned too many times by Fallout 4, by Cyberpunk 2077 when I get too hyped for things. I just think it's something that we don't need as members of this industry. I think hype can be a toxic thing. It can be very, very fun, but it can be toxic and it can ruin an otherwise pretty good game for people that were hoping it would be amazing. So when we talk about expectations, I was expecting probably a pretty good game. I guessed that it would probably land somewhere around a B or a B+, that it would be pretty good. I guess that it would probably have a handful of technical issues at launch because it was coming from a smaller studio. And the last example I can think of a smaller studio that previously only worked on smaller, sort of more niche titles or children's games that then got blown into the stratosphere of attention with a major AAA or quadruple A release. Last example I could think of was like Days Gone in 2019. And while I really liked that game, especially once you got past the initial hurdle of gameplay, there's no denying that that game had a ton of graphical issues, bugs, and things that have since been sorted out, but it launched pretty buggy. And that's very, very common with smaller, less experienced studios that are trying to do something way bigger than they normally do. And just for the record, if anybody wants to go check the receipts on these predictions I made, just go over to Luke Stevens Live. I live streamed all of this before the game came out, basically predicted what I thought the game would be like, so you can see for yourself that this is what I thought. I went back and checked it all, but feel free to verify. And it turns out, as far as I can tell, my expectations were pretty much in line with what reality ended up delivering us. The game is pretty good. It's quite buggy, especially at launch. It was quite iffy for some people. We'll get into that in a little bit. But all told, they didn't cut any major features that were announced. They didn't come out and say there was going to be wall running and then there's no wall running or anything like that. They said what they were making. They were transparent, showed it off beforehand, did press releases and gameplay demos and things, showed people what they were going to get, and delivered on it. One of the unfortunate things that was also described before the game came out was that there would be a PS5 exclusive quest and that the deluxe version would also get some exclusive items. In the case of the PlayStation 5, they get access to an exclusive quest that will be available on PC and Xbox allegedly in about a year. I don't know that for a fact, but that's what some people have been saying. And as for the deluxe edition, it's basically access to the Dark Arts Arena, the Thestral Mount, some cool cosmetics and stuff that you can buy separately, though it's important to note, again, you cannot buy the exclusive PlayStation Quest until that year mark has passed. And I think it's important to note that that PS5 exclusive quest has been called by many people the best quest in the game, which is a bit of a bummer for people who are not on PlayStation. You really gotta love the pro-consumer approach that PlayStation has about this stuff, you know. It's not like they're going and lecturing Xbox about taking things away from players and making it exclusive and how bad that is, and then they're doing the exact same thing. It's not like that at all, but whatever. And before anybody's like, oh my God, Luke sounds so bitter towards all this. He sounds like such a sad Xbot. I don't know how many Xbots have 3 PS5s in their house, okay? Like, I'm no Xbot, but I'm certainly not a Sony brony. I don't mess with any of the console war garbage, but I call it like I see it. And the PlayStation exclusivity stuff sucks. The Xbox exclusivity stuff sucks. It all sucks. Anyway, back on topic, because of this PlayStation exclusive quest, I knew that I probably was going to play on PC, especially I just got this new 4090 equipped PC, so I wanted to really crank the graphics so when I made this video, you guys could look at the best version of the game that currently exists. The other aspect of that, though, is that I can't enjoy that PlayStation exclusive quest, and I want to be able to talk about it in this video. So I recruited my wife, who is also a gamer and likes Harry Potter stuff as well. She recorded her playthrough on the PlayStation 5 upstairs in the family room as she went through the game, and I've collected all of the footage from that as well. So she ran through playing Ravenclaw. I went through this game playing as Slytherin for reasons we'll discuss a little bit later, and this meant that I was able to test and compare different choices and consequences within side quests, the main story, all of this stuff, and just see if it mattered, because I played as a super evil Slytherin and she played as a goody two-shoes Ravenclaw, and we just wanted to see if it mattered, and we ran into some predictable but interesting results that, again, we'll discuss a little bit later. As for technical issues, as I said, there's a handful. I won't dwell on these too much because most of these issues are going to be patched in the months after launch. While I'm recording this video, this is still an issue. There are a handful of problems, frame stutters and occasional pop-in glitches, things like that. But by the time you're watching this video, 6 months or a year from now, or even further, say hi if you're from the future, I guess, it's probably fixed. So it doesn't really make sense to dwell on these and make a big deal out of it. I will say I didn't run into anything game breaking. I don't think I had any crashes or anything in my time with Hogwarts Legacy. I, of course, am running this on particularly potent hardware, so I perhaps am not the best person to ask, but my wife Nikki also said she didn't run into anything except for pop-in, load screens being a little longer while you're exploring Hogwarts Castle, things like that, but nothing really problematic, I would say. And lastly, my only other expectation going into Hogwarts Legacy was that this was apparently a much bigger game than I initially expected. I was braced for it to be 15 to 20 hours, and that was it. That it would be like a great 20-hour game, and then there would just be nothing to do after that, just a big empty castle and some fields surrounding it. But no, this game's massive, and in some leaks that dropped about a week before the game came out, it was revealed that this game was probably around 35 hours to finish the main story, and it offered as much as 70 to 80 hours to those who wanted to 100% complete it. And this, of course, made me quite excited. This game was much bigger and meatier than we expected, and that's usually not a bad thing. Oh yeah, except for in this case.
Assassin's Creed Valhalla.
It will never get old, I swear. But all told, going into Hogwarts Legacy, I was pretty excited and very intrigued to see what they would do with this. And as the game started going out to reviewers and the reviews then dropped, the reception was generally quite positive, and then early access went up on February 7th to those who ordered the deluxe edition or collector's edition of the game, and people started playing, and let's just start from there. When you boot up the game, you'll immediately be struck with the Harry Potter music. It's recognizable, it's tightly composed, and oh, it hits you in the feels. You'll load in after calibrating your game with Gamma and all of the regular things, and you'll be greeted with a letter from Professor Weasley, the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts. It reads that you've been invited to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry as a 5th-year student, and that the term begins on September 1st, implying that that is when the game is beginning. There isn't a lot discussed about your character before the events of this game. We don't really know why you've been invited, we don't know what your backstory is, and they never really talk about it. Some people might have a real problem with that, and it might really frustrate them that we just are entering as a 5th year and it's never really talked about why we're just now entering. Is there a reason? Did we do something particularly of note? Why am I being escorted by 2 adults to the school? The whole thing is just a little strange and it's never really addressed. The other way you could look at this though is that it's simply a trope of these types of games. The main character is meant to be a blank canvas upon which you can cast yourself. If they give the player character a backstory, extended lore, and the like, very quickly it will cease to feel like you are exploring Hogwarts and the wizarding world, but rather that you are just along for the ride while this character explores the world. And I think it's important to note this tonal element because this is reflected all throughout the creation and design of Hogwarts Legacy. This game is supposed to be a sandbox in which you can just play and make your own fun. It's not really meant to be a super serious or gritty RPG. It's not meant to be taken or torn apart in this like dense narrative way. It's just meant to kind of be there for you to dink around in. And in that capacity, it's really, really successful. The only problem comes when you start to put a lot of pressure on those pieces because they're just not made to be robust. It's like criticizing Skittles for not being nutritious or saying that like Red Bull is bad because it doesn't have calcium. Maybe it does, I don't know. But you get what I'm saying. Like it's not as good as milk, therefore it's bad. It's like, well, I guess, but that's not what it's supposed to be. It's not trying to do that. It's trying to do something else. And you have to understand what a game is trying to do before you can start to critique it or break it apart for not living up to that expectation or standard that you have. This is something that we have to talk about a lot with video games just because often it's easy for us to start criticizing a game for not being what we wanted it to be and hating on it because it's something else entirely. There is some responsibility, of course, with the developers. If they are making something nobody wants, that's a problem. Like with the new Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League game. That's a game that seemingly very, very few people want, especially from a company like Rocksteady, who made the Arkham games. And so they're creating a product trying to do something that players just simply don't want to do. And you can also run into issues as they did recently with the game Forspoken, where you have multiple things you're trying to do at the same time, and you just don't do any of them well enough to be exceptional. In that case, they wanted like a deep and intense narrative with a character you love, but then they also wanted like a flashy combat system. And while they had a great flashy combat system that actually is pretty robust, the narrative was so bad that it actively detracted from the combat system. I really believe if Forspoken had cut the narrative entirely and had a voiceless protagonist, I think the game would have been a lot better. But in the context of Hogwarts Legacy, what we need to be clear on is that I think a sequel could do a phenomenal job of living up to those standards and taking this formula and making a more serious or mature version of this world for you to explore, similar to what the Harry Potter films and books did, where they started basically on the level of what an 11-year-old would expect. And then as Harry and Hermione and everybody grew up, the stories grew up too, and the world grew up and got more serious. If they can do that with this game, things could get really, really interesting. But the point is, they were trying to make a game that's not super serious and lets you be the hero of your own story. And as we look through the main story and everything else over the course of this video, as long as you remember that, a lot of these design choices start to make much more sense. After we're done with the letter, we immediately jump into the character creator where you can create your avatar. This thing's pretty solid, though it is unfortunate most of the characters end up just looking like slightly morphed versions of each other. I don't know. I think it looks good. The characters you make look pretty good, but they all look like they're brothers and sisters or cousins of each other. They all look weirdly similar and I don't really know why. So if they could make this a little bit more versatile in the sequel, that would be awesome. Oh, also note, do not use the voice modulator, whatever you do. If you do, your character is going to start to sound like they're talking into a tin can roughly 15 minutes into the game. And as of right now, like 3 weeks after launch, it still isn't fixed. If you choose this voice modulator thing in the menus, your character just sounds horrible for the whole game. Hopefully they fix this, but dear God, it's bad. But setting all of that aside, once you actually begin the game, you'll be struck with what I noticed immediately, which is that this game has a much darker tone to begin with than I expected. By the way, did you notice my costume change? Yeah, it's pretty good, right? It's been like a week and a half since I filmed the first chunk of this, so I'm just gonna, we're just gonna jump back in. Bunch of stuff happened in the personal life, but I'm back. We're gonna keep going, okay? Let's do it. As the game begins, you'll have a brief conversation with Professor Fig. It appears you're within London about to take off for Hogwarts. There's no information given to the player as to who you are, what your background is, or why you're going to Hogwarts now instead of earlier, since after all, it's being revealed at this moment that you are going to be entering Hogwarts as a 5th year, not as a 1st year. Now, there's been a lot of conversations and debates as to why they chose to have the player start as a 5th year as opposed to earlier on. I had a collaboration I did with Retro Raconteur, who's done a ton of nitty-gritty detailing and analysis of Hogwarts Legacy. He covered the game extensively before launch, covering rumors and speculation, all that good stuff. And in my conversation with him before the game's launch, he outlined a few theories as to why they might have done this. Chief among them seems to be that people are convinced that this will likely be the first game in a trilogy. Starting as a 5th year sets it up perfectly for that. We also know that around the time of this game's events, Albus Dumbledore is like a 1st year somewhere in this range, so possibly in the next game we'll see him as a 1st year, or perhaps in the 3rd game, and we could tie in the events of the books and the films into the game series. There's a lot of potential for what they're doing here. So I just want to say that I don't think it's just a coincidence you're starting as a 5th year. It seems very, very tactical. Though that being said, it's important to note that there won't be a ton of exposition as it relates to the main character. I'm okay with this, and this is actually a staple of a lot of role-playing games where they want you to become immersed in the world. Famously, Bethesda game studios in the past haven't put a lot of effort into defining or explaining where the player character comes from. In my opinion, that's why Fallout 4 stuck out like a sore thumb from the very earliest moments you were playing the game, because it wasn't just a blank canvas upon which you could project yourself as we had in Skyrim and Oblivion and Fallout 3 to a certain extent, where you're starting from childhood and you get to create the character in your own image. Instead, we were starting with a pre-designed character, somebody who has a background, who's either a lawyer if you choose the female protagonist or a veteran if you choose the male protagonist. They have a backstory, and that limits what you can do in terms of role-playing in its purest sense. And so to see them go this route where they just don't really talk about where you come from, they don't really talk about your family, they don't talk about why you're being invited to Hogwarts now as opposed to earlier, none of that's covered. Maybe they'll cover that in a sequel or something, allow you to create the backstory. But as of right now, it's important to note that they just leave it totally blank, and I'm actually okay with that. After a brief conversation with Professor Fig, we'll be approached by George Osric. Soon after, everybody loads into the magical carriage to take off towards Hogwarts. And on the way to Hogwarts, it's revealed that Eleazar Fig's since deceased wife, Miriam, had written to Osric in the last few months. Basically, it seems as though she had been asking what the Ministry knew about the goblin agitator Ranrock, his various plots, and it's also revealed that she sent him an object, a box, but he couldn't actually open it. Out of nowhere, the player character is able to open the box effortlessly, and upon doing so, it's revealed that it contained a key. And this next bit is just freaking badass, so I'm just gonna let it play instead of trying to rehash it verbally.
Merlin's beard? How did you... Wait! We do...
Oh! Wow.
The key! Give me your hand!
It's Portkey. So that was pretty badass. Which one is Hogwarts? Now I'll be real, this was way better as an intro than I was expecting. For one, it's a little dark and gritty. It shows that there's stakes in this world, and this isn't going to be like a sorcerer's stone, everything is light and kind of silly and magical. No, like, this is going to be serious. There are actual consequences and stakes for the characters that are navigating this world during this story. And I think it sets it up tremendously well, especially the bit with the Thestrals where you hop into the carriage initially, you don't see the Thestrals pulling the magical wagon. And then after you witness George being swallowed whole by a dragon, all of a sudden you can see the Thestrals out of nowhere. It's super smooth, it's super well done, and I just loved this intro. I thought it was great. Now, a couple of points to begin with. For one, it's been established that Eleazar's wife is a main substantial character in this story. Two, Professor Fig seemingly is extremely important in this story, and the player character has abilities that are inexplicable. It seems as though they have some sort of ability to detect, sense, or employ ancient magic, and that's going to have a major impact on the story, no doubt. But once again, this is something that's never really discussed in a lot of detail, mainly because they don't want to give the player character too much detail. They don't want to explain too much. So instead, you just kind of have to take it for granted that, yeah, you have magical abilities. Yes, you have the ability to sense ancient magic, which is an extremely rare ability, which is why this whole story kicks off into motion. And you just kind of go along with it. It's not quite as bad as like the Skyrim College of Winterhold thing where you just waltz in, you do 10 minutes of activities, and all of a sudden you're the head mage and like headmaster of the entire college. But it still requires you to just accept that you are very, very special in this world. And while I understand their decision to do that because it allows them to employ a lot more interesting gameplay mechanics and things, I also really wonder what it would be like to play a Hogwarts style game where you're not that exceptional, where you are just a student and what makes you exceptional are your behaviors, activities, the things that you do, not necessarily the way you were born. Like, I get it. Again, I understand why they chose to do this. I don't know. I'm conflicted because I think it could have been really cool to experiment on the other side because we've already had the story of Harry Potter, who of course is extremely special, and you just kind of go along with it and it's a good ride. But again, he's very, very special. And so I was interested to see if they would do something where they tell a story of just a regular student and they see how they could navigate this world and potentially do great things just by being great and doing great things. And instead we have this, which again, I get it, but it'll be interesting to see if they can play around with this in future games for sure. After taking the Portkey into this mysterious cave, healing up with some Wiggenweld potion, and becoming acclimated with the controls, you'll exit the cave and see in the distance the ruins of a mansion. This was one of the first things that was shown off in the trailers for the game, this particular shot, and the scene that will follow shortly where the bridge is reconstructed using magic. And they actually managed to make this look even better in the final release on consoles and PC than what we saw in those trailers. If you look at the trailer section of this bridge being rebuilt, you can see terrible artifacting from the screen space reflections they're using on the water. But in the final release on PlayStation 5 here, as you can see on screen now, that's not there. They managed to bake in the reflections or do something where they were able to avoid this bizarre artifacting that would have been extremely distracting. And props to Avalanche Games. They managed to actually improve the fidelity of the final release over and above what we saw in the pre-release trailers. And that, unfortunately, is very rare nowadays. After crossing the reconstructed bridge and exploring the mansion, you find a portal which instantly transports you directly underneath Gringotts Bank. This for me was really, really cool. I was hoping we would see places other than Hogwarts and the surrounding lands in this game, and Gringotts Bank is one of the staple places and locations of the franchise. Of course, if you've been to Universal Studios Orlando, you will probably have ridden Escape from Gringotts, which is a sort of 4D bizarre roller coaster traction ride. It's super, super awesome. It's one of my favorite rides in the entire park of Universal Studios Orlando. And to be able to explore the bank in the game was also really, really cool. Though exploring the bank might be a little generous because this whole sequence is heavily on tracks, literally as you ride tracks down into the depths of the bank, but it's still really, really cool to see it in the game. And quick sidebar, there's been a lot of conversations as to what they're going to do in a sequel, and we're going to talk more about those expectations later, but this is one of those things where there might be some potential, especially because they have already established that they want to show it off. They have designed a lot of the bank, as you can see here, but when you're talking about a sequel to a game like Hogwarts Legacy, Hogwarts as a location is, of course, a major, major element of these games, or at least it should be in my opinion. The moment you take these games and stories away from Hogwarts, they start to lose some of the magic, because Hogwarts Castle in and of itself in many ways is a character, a main character of these stories. It's why some of the later Harry Potter films started to feel a little off, because you started to leave Hogwarts and just explore through forests and caves and ruins, and it didn't really feel like Harry Potter in the pure sense. Same with Fantastic Beasts, where it feels magical and fantastical, but it doesn't feel like a Harry Potter or Hogwarts oriented franchise in the same way. Maybe that's just me, but to me, Hogwarts as a location is just as big a part of this whole formula as anything else. So for a sequel, it'll be interesting to see if they open up Diagon Alley or allow you to go through Gringotts. And maybe this is one of those things like in God of War Ragnarok, where you can fight through waves of enemies in the bank as you work lower and lower into the depths of the bank, getting more and more riches as you go. You could fight goblin guards, or you could fight like magical creatures that have been enchanted and that protect these vaults as you loot them. There's a ton of cool stuff you could do with Gringotts Bank in a sequel or in an expansion or a DLC. So I'm very intrigued to see what they do with it, because there's lots of potential. But as we travel deeper and deeper into the bank, it's revealed that the port key we used to transfer to the cave that then led to the mansion that led us here is also just, well, a key. It opens one of the oldest vaults in the entire bank, built soon after the bank's original founding hundreds of years ago. Inside the vault, we participate in some basic tutorials around Revelio, a spell that will reveal different objects in the environment to you, and you'll get a crash course tutorial on how the combat system works by fighting these ancient magical guardians. Once we find a pensive and look inside to view the memories of somebody long since passed on, we can see that there's another character by the name of Percival Rackham who's speaking with somebody by the name of Charles Rookwood, and it's revealed that this Percival character has the same ability the player character does. He's able to see and conjure ancient magic. It's also established that Percival and this other character, and seemingly others by inference, have concocted a series of trials which will allow the player to prove themselves worthy of the knowledge and the responsibility that accompanies it. Whatever the hell that means, I'm not even sure. What I took from this was that this was probably going to be one of those games where there's 3, 4, or 5 challenges or major dungeons or something that the player's expected to work through, and then after they've done that, they'll be able to access the final mission, which will kick off then. Sort of similar to how Breath of the Wild did things with the different ancient beasts that you could take on, but in the case of Breath of the Wild, you could just jump straight to the Ganon fight if you wanted. It would just be way, way harder. Whereas in this case, you can't just jump into the final trial. You have to go through those hoops. So I get it. It works. But again, it just reinforces the idea that this is sort of a cellophane story. This story is not meant to really shake your foundations. It's just meant to be something that roughly guides you through the game, through the map, and empowers you to explore the map and the places that they've crafted here. It's not really meant to be anything more than that. After this revelation, a character comes in and we realize it's Ranrock, the goblin that's been referenced in the conversations prior to this with George and everybody else, who seemingly was causing such a ruckus that Miriam, the wife of Professor Fig, was extremely concerned about it. We don't know much about Ranrock at this time, but what we do see is the goblin banker insisting that he doesn't have a right to be inside this vault because the instructions for the vault very clearly outlined that only the holders of the key were allowed to enter. And because we all know how this type of thing ends when you go to your boss and explain to them that they're breaking policy, he dies. Ranrock picks him up and slams him into the ground, seemingly killing him. It's important to note that he's not using a wand or even saying any spell out loud while he does this, which in the world of Harry Potter and Hogwarts is indicative of somebody who's extremely powerful with magic. Professor Fig tries to attack him for this, but Ranrock doesn't so much as break a sweat. He just pushes him away. A large guardian is then spawned, which Ranrock and his assistants try to deal with, which gives the player and Professor Fig a chance to escape through a portal that they see on the side of the room. Once they do so, they realize that this has led them into a forest area just outside of Hogwarts. And what ensues is one of the best title sequences, as far as I'm concerned, of any game in recent memory. I freaking love this. I would let it just play out loud, but let's be completely honest, the Harry Potter music almost certainly would be copyright struck, in which case I'd make nothing from this video, which would give me instantaneous heartburn. So I'm just gonna let you look at it and imagine the music, or maybe I can do it. Na, 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 na. See, that's just as good. Just as good, guys. Just as good. Stop complaining. Be thankful. In the following moments, a few things happen. We go through the sorting ceremony, and you can pick an answer to a couple of questions, at which point it will try to automatically sort you. It's important to note here as well that if you tied your Wizarding World account, which you can sign up for online and take a much more extensive and expansive quiz on which house you should belong to, it would automatically detect what your house affiliation was and also what your wand choice was. And you will get that reflected in the choices in the game. So you don't have to do the quiz all over again, and you don't have to go through selecting your wand all over again. It just does it automatically. I thought that was super, super cool, and I'm glad to see it here. However, if you don't want to go with that choice, you can override that choice and select a different house. I'm a Ravenclaw, according to the tests. Kind of makes sense, right? I mean, it's a very Ravenclaw thing to do, to make a video like this on a video game. So I'm a Ravenclaw, but for the sake of this video and the experimentation we do inside of these reviews and critiques, I elected to choose Slytherin as my playthrough, mainly because my wife Nikki chose to go through as a Gryffindor and play as a goody two-shoes the whole game. And so I wanted to see just how different consequences and decisions could be. So I selected Slytherin, and I chose that I was going to play as evil and nasty as I possibly could. Every decision I was prompted with, where I could just give somebody their pet back that I had rescued, I would ask them for money in exchange for giving it back. And if they didn't give me money, I would keep the pet for myself, which does happen a couple of times. You can do that. And honestly, it was somewhat freeing. The game does give you the chance to be kind of a prick a handful of times, which I appreciate. It's not quite the same thing as a lot of other faux RPGs where they give you like the choice of good, less good, and then okay. It's like you can be a good guy, you can be a slightly worse guy, and then you can be a prick. It never lets you just be straight up evil, but you know, I'll take what I can get. It's also a game about children, so I don't want to be like, it didn't let me kill all of the students. Like, come on. Of course it didn't. It's a game about children. It's fine. It's also in this opening section that we'll be introduced to Professor Black. Professor Black is a character I was very, very interested in leading up to the game's launch because he's played by Simon Pegg, who's an actor I very much enjoy. So I was excited to see what they did with this character. And I hate to report that they do like almost nothing. He's barely in the game at all. I don't know if it was just that they didn't pay for enough screen time or voice time, I guess, with him, and so they didn't have the chance to do much. Or maybe COVID resulted in like decreased recording times or something like that, or perhaps even just sections and missions with him got cut as they got closer to launch. I have no idea. All I know is that this was a character I was looking forward to getting to know and get familiarized with, and he's barely in the game at all. But one of the things that they established pretty early on is that thanks to an injury on the pitch in last spring's final of Quidditch, they've decided to cancel the Quidditch season for this school year. This to me feels like a later alteration to the dialogue because it kind of comes out of nowhere, and it seems to exist purely to explain why Quidditch isn't in this game. Because if the Quidditch season were going on, obviously the player would get involved with that. It would be really weird to have this awesome, huge thing going on the side that the player character just can't even try. So they probably cut Quidditch relatively early on or halfway through development, and then they just decided we'll throw in a line from the headmaster explaining that there was an injury, so they've canceled it. I find it stupid. I think Quidditch would have been a great addition. I get that they had to choose between Quidditch and other things and levels of polish that they wanted to achieve. So all told, I get it. I think it was a worthy trade-off, but I would greatly appreciate Quidditch in a DLC expansion or a second game altogether. We also meet Professor Weasley in this opening section, and regardless of which house you choose, she will lead you to your common room. And each of these are unique. On one playthrough, I chose to start the game as a Ravenclaw, and in order to get into the Ravenclaw house, you have to answer a riddle. Again, very Ravenclaw. For the other houses, it's pretty straightforward. You basically just go into the house, walk in, and move on. You'll have conversations with various characters that are meant to be your classmates. Most of these will also prompt you for side quests later on. So while it's interesting to meet them now, most of these characters aren't used to their fullest extent. You'll have a brief conversation with them right now, but it's going to last maybe 2-3 minutes, and then after this they're gonna later on ask you to like help them find a statue in Hogwarts Castle that they heard exists, and you just have to find it, and then you complete a side mission. So a lot of them are just here kind of as filler. I would hope that in the sequel or whatever they do in the future, they can really expand these characters out, maybe embrace a companion system where you can choose different classmates to help you explore the world and do stuff. I think that could be really, really interesting and cool. But as for right now, the classmates are very, very much set dressing to the rest of the story. You'll attend your first handful of classes in this opening section as well, meeting characters like Professor Ronan, having more conversations with Professor Weasley, and then going into Hogsmeade to get your wand from Ollivanders and perform some basic other tasks that get you established in the world. And here, as I mentioned earlier, they allow you to fully customize your wand, which was a really cool addition. Granted, it's going to be very, very small in your hand during combat sequences, and most of the time you won't notice it. So it's probably a bit of a waste of time to spend a lot of time customizing this wand out, but nonetheless, it's super cool to see that they went to the trouble of adding all of this in here. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you completed the questionnaire on thewizardingworld.com, you can actually just have that ported in here, so you don't have to do any of these selections. It just works. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a collection of all of the in-game stats and all the CSV tables and everything that they use to balance the game and calculate damage numbers, all of that. And as far as I can tell, there is no calculable or noticeable difference for whether or not you're using a wand of a certain type, of a dragon heartstring or a unicorn ding dong. Like none of it really matters. It's all calculated straight. There's no effect like, oh, you deal more damage if you have this type of wand over this type of wand. There's nothing like that. You could, in theory, do something like that for the sequel. Maybe they open it up with like the character's wand being broken, so they have to get another one. I know that causes problems in the lore, but still you could do something like that. And then you have this whole system where you can have a sub RPG system built around wand customization. But again, that creates problems in the lore because you're not really supposed to be altering your wand in real time in the world of Harry Potter. So it causes problems. I get why they chose not to have it affect gameplay, but still it could be an interesting thing to add, just another layer of complexity in a sequel, even if it's only a one-time choice. I mean, just imagine the fun that like speedrunners would have with trying to figure out which wand combination was the most effective for the boss fights that you'll be engaging with. Like there's a lot of cool stuff you could do with wand customization, but in the case of Hogwarts Legacy, it doesn't have any impact on the game after this initial choice. It changes the look of the wand, I guess, but other than that, there's nothing. Now, in this opening section, as I mentioned, we're also introduced to Hogsmeade. We're going to talk more about this in detail in a few moments, but for now, I'll just say that it serves as a nice introduction to a place which players will be all too familiar with from the films, from the books, and even from the theme parks, which is a YouTube channel you should check out. They did a great 4K high quality walkthrough video of the park, and you can see just how amazing this recreation is. I mean, all the snow on the buildings, all the stores are recreated tremendously well. And other than the swarms of people like maggots on a carcass, it is actually a really calming place. And in the game, this recreation of Hogsmeade is also very, very well done. Though I will say, I never felt that it was as alive as I was expecting. It always felt as though the NPCs here were, again, purely set dressing. They didn't do anything. They weren't walking from shop to shop or doing anything. They just stand there, repeat some animation cycles, and that's it. But again, we're going to talk more about Hogsmeade in a little bit when we talk about the overall design of Hogwarts, Castle, and Hogsmeade in general. But all told, at this point, we're about an hour and a half to 2 hours into the game. And so we've got some first impressions established. For one, I will say that the game is graphically pretty good. Of course, on PlayStation 5 performance mode, the quality isn't quite where I would like it, but for a console version running at 60, it's not bad. I also have played this game a fair amount on my Steam Deck, and it runs fairly inconsistently, though again, well enough that I can manage. I mean, it's a modern 2023 AAA game that I can run on a portable device, so the fact it runs at all is honestly kind of impressive. And while it doesn't land at like a solid 60, even with low settings, with the AI upscaling, with 720p as the render resolution, it still bounces between like 40 and 55 most of the time. So it's not the steadiest thing, but it's playable and you can enjoy exploration, though perhaps not like really intense combat while on the Steam Deck. And I mean, props to them. They didn't have to make sure this thing was Steam Deck verified day one, but they chose to do that and make that a priority, and props. That's an awesome thing. And for me, as a PC player, it really adds to the credibility of the optimization when you tell me that not only is the game coming to PC, but also we're getting it Steam Deck verified. That shows that you're spending enough effort on trying to optimize it, that you're taking those steps to work with Steam and to make sure that these boxes are checked. So it's a good look. Of course, there are performance issues, as I mentioned earlier, with some of the technical issues. There's some frame drops. There's some weird load time optimizations where when you're exploring Hogwarts Castle, you'll have to wait before going through a doorway for it to finish loading and let you through. And that stuff is annoying, but bizarrely enough, it doesn't really impact my enjoyment of the exploration of the world. I thought it would. Most games it normally would, but I think that's more a testament to how well they've put this thing together and also the power of this franchise and the world that is here, because players can deal with that stuff and they frankly don't care. Whereas for other games that aren't in this franchise, they probably would. Granted, it's basically a logical fallacy to say that this game, I don't care about the graphical hitching and the frame drops and things, but in this game I do. And the only difference between them is subject matter. That is a fallacy. That is a leap in logic. If we're being consistent in how we evaluate these things, we should be consistent. We should say that it's not okay over here and it's not okay over here. But in terms of enjoyment of the game, what I'm reporting to you is that for me, I didn't feel like, okay, I can't play this. I'm going to put it down until they fix these bugs and the frame hitching. I can't really explain to you why, other than my brain just enjoyed exploring and seeing more of this world enough that it was willing to put up with those issues. And part of it perhaps is that the gameplay, the exploration, the controls, everything else is sort of built in a way where you can have a little bit of that stutter and the sluggishness, and it won't qualitatively affect your time with the game. Whereas if you're playing something like Elden Ring, which had a terrible PC launch in terms of optimization on day one, you could be playing that game and there's all sorts of stutters and drops, which for that game, combat is the name of the game. And to have stutters every time a boss throws an attack at you just makes the game unplayable. Whereas a couple of frame drops here and there while flying on your broomstick is not actually that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. So yes, it's special pleading, it's sort of a special exception, but it's also just a reflection of the type of game this is, and then also the subject matter included. Players just love this world so much that they're willing to put up with more stuff. It's unfortunate. I think that they should have polished this a little bit more, and I'm sure they're going to continue to polish this in the months to come. But as of right now, even about a month and a half after launch, there are still some hitchings. There's still some problems graphically with some pop-in and weird load time issues. As I run this off of my 4090, like this still is having problems, and I hope they fix it in the future because this game deserves it, frankly. Other first impressions would include the tremendous music and the score included here. As I alluded to earlier, this is one of the frustrations I have with games like this that are part of established franchises, because I would normally like to just put the music as the background track for this type of critique, but I can't do that because all of this is copyrighted out the ass. Like, I will never be able to play any of the music without getting this entire video demonetized, and it'd just be terrible. So I am just not going to do that, but I'm sure I don't need to tell you that the music in this game is great.
Hey guys, quick little editor's note. We were actually able to pay for the rights to one of the songs from Harry Potter. We only got a little tidbit of it, and it's one of the unused tracks from, I believe, the third film. It cost about $18,000 for us to get, but it's considered lost media, so we thought it was worth it. So here it is for you for the first time ever from John Williams himself, one of the unused Dobby themes from Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, 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 Hogwarts Castle, Harry Potter, Harry Potter, Harry Potter, Harry Potter, Harry Potter.
They've managed to strike a balance between an homage to the films and then also making it its own. They've also said in various interviews before and after the launch of the game that they wanted to make sure that the music felt familiar and then also separate. And because this game takes place roughly a century before the events of Harry Potter, they decided to also simplify the music so that it reflects the simpler times. And all told, it's done very, very well. Now, another thing that I was looking forward to experiencing in my first few hours of the game was broom flight. But that's something that the game takes anywhere from 3 to 5 hours to introduce to you, mainly because they want to make sure you get your feet under you in terms of combat, in terms of basic understanding of the gameplay loop, those types of things, before they give you access to that. I understand why they chose to do this, but I found it quite frustrating because I wanted to just get out and explore. I wanted to go do stuff, but in this game, they really take their sweet time. So you will likely be spending the first 5 hours completing side quests and grinding up your XP instead of navigating outside the castle. If you really enjoy exploring the castle, you won't mind it, and honestly, that time will probably fly. But for me, I wanted to fly myself, and so I grew a little bit frustrated in these first few hours while waiting for access to the broom. I might be alone in that. Some of you probably experienced something similar where it's not that you didn't like exploring the castle, you just wanted to be able to explore everything and anything. So this is going to be kind of a mixed bag. It's more a matter of personal opinion. One of the things I still feel, though, is not a matter of personal opinion is the Dementor inclusion. Now, you may have just heard me mention Dementors, and you could have finished this game and you're like, what Dementors? And that's kind of the point. There are Dementors in this game, and that's important because they were included on the box art for the collector's edition and the deluxe edition of the game. I mean, I'm not crazy here. You see the castle, the Thestrals in the background, thunder and lightning, which unfortunately there aren't really a lot of weather systems in the game. That would have been a really cool thing to have, like a dynamic thunderstorm system and things like that. But you know what? It's, you know, beggars can't be choosers. But down here you can see also they have Dementors. Clearly visible. And my understanding is if you show something in the artwork for the game that you use to advertise it, the expectation is that that's going to be in the game, right? That you're going to be able to see not just Hogwarts Castle and this player character, and then the undead, creepy, ghosty ghoulies, and the big spiders, and the dragons over here, but that you also will see the Dementors. But here's the thing. The Dementors are only available to Hufflepuffs for about 30 seconds. I'm not joking. To see this for myself, I decided to replay the opening hours of the game to get to about level 10 and experience this side quest for myself. In this Hufflepuff exclusive side quest, you actually get to visit Azkaban. You have to go through the opening hours of the game, get to the point where you help the lady on the side of the lake completing the first Merlin trial, and then you'll get prompted with a note that tells you you need to go and speak to the portrait inside of the Hufflepuff common room. Once you do this, you'll complete a very quick quest where you're transported to Azkaban because they need your help, apparently, for some reason. And let me just be clear, this is extremely contrived. It doesn't honestly feel grounded at all. This feels like they just were trying to come up with some reason to get the player to Azkaban for 2-3 minutes, and this was the best they could come up with. They're like, oh, we need a student's help because you're capable and you're good at stuff, and you have that book, which is the field guide, and you need that for this, so we're going to take you to the worst place in the wizarding world, even though that seems irresponsible and you're only going to be there for about a minute and a half, whatever, we're just going to do that. It feels really odd. And I'm not joking. You get transported there with this lady. You see the Dementors off in the distance. She casts Expecto Patronum. They get blown off. And that's the last you see of the Dementors in the entire game. You walk down this hallway, see a few prisoners, you speak to this crazy lady, and then you're transported back out. I know it might seem like I'm exaggerating, but I really took my time walking through Azkaban, at least the section we get access to, and this whole section lasts about 4 minutes and 15 seconds. If you were just walking straight from the location you start at the end of the hallway to the other side, it would probably take you just under 3 minutes, honestly. And the section with Dementors lasts in total, hold on, let me count. Okay, I have my stopwatch. I'm gonna start it the moment that the Dementors come on screen. Are you ready? Wait for it, wait for it. There they are, I see them there, timer going. Okay, they're coming. Oh, spooky, spooky, ghosty, ghouly, so scary. They come at you. And then she casts Expecto Patronum. Expecto Patronum. It's a bunny. And they get blasted away. And you're ready. That's the last we see of them. All told, about 20 seconds. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe I'm greedy. I don't know. I just honestly thought that if they included Dementors in the box art and advertising campaign, that they'd be in the game for more than 20 seconds. But Not really, no. Maybe there's a section of the game I never found where you get to experience them a lot more, but even in the Dark Arts arena, even in places like that, you don't get to see them, and this is the only place, as far as I'm aware, that they appear in the entire game. So I will say this is a point of marked disappointment. For one, that Dementors are locked behind Hufflepuff exclusivity. I get they wanted to have quests exclusive to each house, but to have something as cool as access to Azkaban and then also Dementors locked behind house affiliation just kind of blows to me. And secondly, the fact that it's so short-lived is a real bummer as well. Now, beyond these smaller quests, the player will spend the first 3 to 5 hours slowly making their way through the castle grounds, exploring some familiar areas and some new places that have yet to be seen, although they were likely described in the books. And every square inch of the castle is fantastically well realized, and it's extremely impressive what they managed to do here. It really does feel like you're exploring this real castle, the same one that Harry and all of his groupies explored, or I guess will explore. And this is probably the first moment that things will start to become polarizing for players. As I alluded to earlier with regards to the broom, one of my college buddies spent 10 hours playing through these opening sections, whereas I felt frustrated in the opening hours because I knew what was outside the castle too. I just wanted to get on my broom and start exploring. So instead of spending the first chunk of my time aimlessly meandering around the castle, I elected to be more deliberate with my time and save the freeform exploration for later. As a result, for some, these opening hours will likely feel extremely sluggish, as they did for me. But for others, like my college roommate, they will probably feel slow but relaxed. And I don't think any one perception is more correct than the other, but I think it's important to acknowledge that some players will certainly have different opinions depending on how they approach exploration in these opening bits. If they wanted to wait until they had all the necessary tools, they would likely find these opening hours extremely slow and frustratingly rigid, whereas if somebody wanted to just immediately start exploring specifically the castle grounds, they will probably be happy with how chill and guided these opening hours are, since they take you all over the castle into every corner and niche for various reasons. Once you finally break out of the castle off to Hogsmeade, you meet some more characters, like the aforementioned shop owners and even Rookwood. Now, Rookwood is an interesting character, mainly in that he's so uninteresting. This character was shown off again in the early promotional materials of the game. He was sort of presented as the right-hand man of Ranrock and that he would be one of the main antagonists of the game. But he also has very, very little screen time, like shockingly little. He just kind of shows up once every few hours for a minute or two, and then he disappears. But he's all anybody's talking about for the last third of the game. It's really, really weird. And I can't help but wonder if they had whole sections with him that were just cut towards the end of development, because it's so weird how little he appears. But in this opening section, we see Rookwood bring 2 massive trolls into Hogsmeade. And this immediately tells us that, again, these guys are not afraid of putting people in danger for the sake of their cause. I think that these types of narrative set pieces and story beats are very, very important because they establish that these villains are not to be trifled with and that there will be actual consequences for getting in their way. I mean, he literally brought trolls to this small village in an attempt to kill some children. If that's not evil, I don't know what is. And I think this is why I'm all the more frustrated by the fact that Rookwood is so underwhelming in terms of villains. He probably could have been really, really interesting, but instead, all we really get to know about him is that he's a bad guy who is bad because he's bad, and that he also likes to have his men help poach animals out in the wilderness, as you see in Poppy's side quest line. But that's it. He's so underutilized and underexplored, it's really bizarre. Similarly, Ranrock himself is severely underdeveloped. Unless you really pay attention and perhaps even do some side research, Ranrock will simply seem like your stereotypical bad guy who wants power because he feels entitled to it due to his lineage. And he's extremely powerful simply because he is. And this is an extremely common problem in Hogwarts Legacy. There are countless examples of characters who the writers seem to just assume you're interested in or captivated by. But unfortunately, they don't take the time to build that relationship with the player. You meet all of your professors when you go to class, and at the end of the game, there's dialogue that I think is supposed to be heartwarming because you see just how proud your professors are of you for overcoming your adversities in your first year. But you don't know any of these professors. Many of them you've only seen or talked to 2 to 3 times roughly through the whole story, usually for less than 5 minutes in total. And this is where the game, I think, really suffers from spreading itself too thin. The Harry Potter books spent multiple entries and many school years building relationships between characters and professors and the secondary cast. But in this game, they try to do it all at the same time, which is why it feels somewhat rushed. And I know it may seem bizarre to say that a game that can entertain you from anywhere between 30 and 80 hours is rushed, but it's simply because they rush this one aspect of the story. They don't take the time to build relationships, but rather they just assume or hope that the player will care about these characters. In the same way that they expect the player to just turn their brain off to the fact that they don't know the backstory for their character, why they're there, what their background is, where their parents are, what they do, any of that stuff. They want you to just turn your brain off to the fact that you don't know these professors, you don't really know the students. So at the end of the school year, when everybody's chanting for you and everybody is like, oh, you rock, you got us extra points, so we win the house cup, all of this stuff, none of it really makes sense because you've spoken with them for just a handful of minutes at the max, and it just feels off. It doesn't work quite right. But if you turn your brain off to it, you're just like, yes, I'm a student at Hogwarts and I'm so happy to be here, and you can have a great time. But you kind of have to turn your brain off to it. And I really do think that they could have pulled this off. If you look at a game like Persona 5, for example, where you are playing as a student meeting various characters, I think you could very reasonably build some amazing relationships with the characters and classmates you have in this game. But instead, they just don't. Instead, they embrace open, endless exploration first and foremost, and relationships with side characters takes a back seat. This is why I think a companion system would be a match made in heaven in this game, something that they sort of play around with in the opening sections of the game, where they send you on missions with Sebastian or Natsai, or side quests where you're running through the forest with Poppy and things like that. But if they allowed you to actually go and work with these characters, either through the main story or through side content separately, I think it could have worked really, really well. Another great example of a character that falls flat as a result of poor development is Lodgok. He's the goblin who helps you take down Ranrock and Rookwood, but later in the game when he's killed right in front of you, it's one of the few times we see the game's main villains doing something clearly bad. And I think that this was supposed to motivate the player to take down Ranrock and Rookwood in the final series of missions. It's sort of the last kickoff before the finale. But for me at least, this moment lacked significant emotional punch. We didn't really get to know Lodgok as far as I'm concerned, not to mention that multiple members of the secondary cast will repeatedly tell you that he shouldn't be trusted and to keep a close eye on him. Granted, this is done in an attempt to signify bigotry towards goblin kind, but either way, it just makes Lodgok seem like somebody we might not know, so we should be cautious. So instead of just building the relationship with Lodgok, we instead watch this guy with skeptical hippo eyes, and then he's killed right in front of us by Ranrock. It's supposed to be an intense, emotionally motivating moment, but instead, it just falls kind of flat. Same with this moment right here, where after he dies, Rookwood flees because he realizes he's no longer needed by Ranrock and is probably going to get jumped by him. The way they filmed this whole sequence just makes me feel like this was supposed to be a big moment where we realize the two antagonists are now separating and will be forces on their own to combat, but instead, it just kind of happens. And it's the same for all of the other characters in the game, except perhaps Sebastian, since you'll spend so much time with him over the course of his side quest. And to be clear, Sebastian's side quest I think is unique because his side quest is specifically tied to a very emotional issue as he learns the dark arts either with you or without you, depending on whether you choose to learn it. And this is just a big bummer because the characters in general through this game are pretty interesting and unique, and there's a lot of potential here. Once I reached the end of the game's story, I realized that some of these characters I really hadn't come to know anywhere near as well as I was hoping to. The ending just came out of nowhere, and I was left somewhat disappointed that I never got the chance to learn more about these people. The clearest example I can think of would be Professor Fig. His death in the final section of the main quest is, at least I think, supposed to be a big moment as well. One of those story beats that makes you angry and leaning towards the screen as you decide to finish this villain once and for all, but that didn't really happen for me. When Ranrock seemingly kills Fig right in front of you, right before the final boss battle, I was left thinking, well, sucks to suck, instead of, oh my god, no. And this is simply because I didn't feel as though I'd gotten to know Professor Fig. When the game starts, you are simply forced into interacting with him in that initial conversation, and you can tell that the protagonist has had some sort of exposure with him previously, seemingly trusting him. And as the story goes on, the protagonist acts as though they've grown closer and are perhaps even friends. But I don't think that many players are going to feel that way in turn. Largely, I think most players will probably feel as though Fig is simply the signpost for the next chapter of the story. This is usually because the player hasn't had the opportunity to get to know some of the more intimate aspects of characters in general. It really wouldn't take much, maybe a little tidbits and cutscenes where you see Professor Fig ferociously devouring chocolate frogs, something he's all but addicted to. It's a small anecdote, but one that will be memorable and also something that makes him endearing. Or perhaps going with Professor Weasley on a walk around the castle grounds on your first day, but she's constantly stopping to straighten the picture frames when they become crooked. Small tidbits like these make characters stand out as having small quirks and individualistic elements. There are a few of these throughout the main story with some of the main cast, but largely it's all business. Cutscenes are for characters talking to each other about the main plot, the trials you need to complete, the threat of the goblins and Rookwood, and that's about it. It's not to say that every character needs to have a goofy series of sequences where you see them not taking things seriously, but it is to say that human beings are defined by their imperfections, by the things that make them individuals. And showing the player more of these for the main cast, I think, would make story beats like the one with Fig at the end far more memorable and impactful. And this also goes for the villains. We hear a lot about how bad Rookwood and Ranrock are, but other than one or two instances like the trolls at the very beginning and the death of Lodgok, we don't actually see many examples of how bad they really are. Or in the case of Rookwood, we see almost nothing of him throughout the entire game, despite his prominence in the marketing materials and in the conversations between players throughout the game. And I'll be real, this one was particularly aggressive to me because I honestly felt as though I had probably missed a quest line where you get to learn more about Rookwood, but no. He's just barely in this game. It's really, really strange. Again, it just reinforces the idea more broadly that this game either suffered significant cuts towards the end where they slashed a series of cutscenes or quest lines and things where you got to know these characters a little bit better, or it just was never there, and everything in terms of the story was always extremely superficial. Again, a cellophane story. I hope in a sequel they can spend more time and effort developing these characters, so when a character like Lodgok dies in front of you, it's impactful. So when Professor Fig dies, seemingly, in front of you, it's impactful, and you're like, oh crap, that sucked ass, and let's get it on, Ranrock, instead of what happens here, which is like, okay. And then you move on. As for side characters, we have a whole bunch. In the case of Hufflepuff, we have Adelaide Oakes, Arthur Plumley, Charlotte Morrison, Evangeline Bardsley, I'm trying to read these and pronounce them properly, Lenora Everly, Poppy Sweeting, who you'll probably know very, very well. Her questline's very, very long, and Saccharissa Tugwood. One of my favorite last names in the entire game without any doubt. I mean, should my stripper name be Tugwood from now on? That's pretty good, right? Also, is it just me or did she kind of stand out the most out of any of the characters in the game? Like specifically her hair with like the purple highlights in it. It seemed like somebody's created character. It didn't seem like a side character. I don't know. This one just stood out to me. I don't know why. In the case of Gryffindor, we have Cressida Bloom, Eric Northcott, Gareth Weasley, Hector Jenkins, Leroy Jenkins, Lawrence Davies, I can read, I swear to God, Leander Pruitt, who's kind of a prick, Lucan Brettleby, who you'll know from the combat arena where you kind of learn the ropes of combat, though you don't see him for much of the rest of the game. Natsai Onai, who you'll do some side quests with as well, and then Nellie Ogspire. All of these names are just badass, aren't they? As for Ravenclaw, we have Amit Thakar, Andrew Larson, Astoria Cricket, I believe, Constance Dagworth, Duncan Hobhouse, Everett Clopton, Gertrude Wiggly. I love Wiggly. She looks like a Wiggly, doesn't she? She looks like a Wiggly. I love it. Mahendra Pelwan, I think, Samantha Dale, Sophronia Franklin, and Zenobia Noak. And real quick, I know what you're thinking, Luke, why are you going through all of these? I want you to just take in how many side characters there are per house. There's tons of student characters, and most of these you probably barely know. You probably can't tell me the name of them off the top of your head, except for a few of them. And that's because they're so underdeveloped. They're used so poorly and infrequently that the potential is just lost. For Slytherin, we have Anne Sallow, though technically I guess this one might not count as a student because she's not currently a student in the game. She's basically on bed rest because she was cursed. I mean, you know the deal if you played Sebastian's questline. Moving on, Grace Pinch Smedley, which Pinch-Smedley is just an awesome name. Love it dearly. Next is Imelda Reyes, or Reyes, perhaps. Nerida Roberts, Ominous Gaunt, who also has one of the coolest names ever in the whole history of Harry Potter. Ominous Gaunt, like, come on. He's also a blind character, which is a really, really interesting thing to do, narratively speaking. And there's a lot of diversity in this cast. I will give them that. There's like a ton. And having a blind wizard was one of those things I didn't expect to see in the game. Is that insensitive? I didn't expect to see it in the... Okay, moving on. YouTuber Luke Stevens gets canceled after making a vision joke in the course of his Hogwarts Legacy critique. We also, of course, have Sebastian Sallow, who we will probably know the best out of any character. Maybe it's just because I was a Slytherin myself during my main playthrough of the game, but I felt as though I got to know Sebastian the best out of any character in the game, full stop. And so... maybe I'm biased, but then again, I think that his questline's the longest, and his questline involves a lot of emotional material, so you get to see a lot of him in vulnerable emotional states, which makes him stand out, to me at least. But then we come to the staff, who are of mixed qualities, in my opinion. Professor Black, as I described earlier, very underutilized without a doubt. This isn't even a controversial statement in my mind. I think everybody was pretty underwhelmed at how little he's used. There is the quest line that we get a little bit later on where you can take on his form with the Polyjuice potion and you get to walk around the school as him. It's cool, but it's a very short quest line, very short-lived. And the fact that the most uninterrupted time we get to see this character is when we are pretending to be him, I think says a lot. We also, of course, have Professor Weasley, who's very sweet and endearing. I really like her as a character, and she definitely takes on the maternal role in the castle. I think she does a great job. Eleazar Fig, who I will insist is one of the most underutilized characters as well. He's in the game a lot, but he never does anything that makes him stand out. He's just kind of there. And as I said earlier, I think he's just sort of a signpost for the next chapter or story mission, and that's about it. He never gets the chance to really stand on his own as a character, and you never get a chance to just be with him or do stuff with him. It's always in the context of some other activity that will distract you. So I find his character wholly underwhelming. I actually had this spoiled for me before the game. We were doing a live stream, and a couple of very loving and progressive people came into chat and started spamming the N-word in all caps in our live chat because we dared to play Hogwarts Legacy. And they were doing this in an attempt to get the stream taken down and struck, or to get us to private it or something. You know, nothing says progressive and like make the world a better place like spamming the N-word in the chat of a live stream of a video game, but you know, whatever. And then they also went in and they, in a coordinated attack, dropped spoilers, including Professor Fig's death, into the live chat as well, so that people would have it spoiled if they were watching live streams of this, which was really, really unfortunate. And again, like, it was a coordinated attack. There were probably 5 to 10 people, all different usernames and everything, that came in at the same time within about 2 to 3 minutes doing all of this at once. And it just goes to show you how dried up a lot of these people are. It's really, really pathetic. And I have to wonder, you know, I don't want to get political or anything, but like, do you think that makes your side look good? Like, if your tactic, yeah, we're in the right. Okay, how are we going to prove we're right? We're going to go into that live stream of people just hanging out, having a good time, and we're going to spam the N-word. Like, at what point do you realize, hey, maybe we're the bad guys? It's like being, you know, on the Death Star, you know, walking around with your little taser, whatever, gun, blaster, and you're like, I'm a Star Trooper and I'm on the Death Star. Are we the bad guys? It's called the Death Star. I think we might be the bad guys. Like, at what point do they realize This is not a good look. Going into live chats and spamming the N-word doesn't make you look like the good person in this conversation. It makes you look like a maniac, and it's only going to further the opposition to your viewpoint. It's only going to make your cause seem less legitimate. Like, it's the dumbest thing you could possibly do. I could agree with your whole argument. I could agree with your whole political stance, with your social justice reform. I could agree with every single point of that. But if your tactics are like that, I don't want anything to do with you. Like, I don't think this is that scandalous a thing to say. It's just freaking dumb. So I will say, though, despite having this Professor Fig death spoiled for me by one of those troglodytes in chat, I didn't feel like I really had much spoiled, because he, as a character, is so underdeveloped that when that moment happened in the game, I was like, oh, okay. It really didn't affect me or impact me hardly at all, because I hadn't grown attached to him. It wasn't like some of the spoilers for The Last of Us or The Last of Us Part 2, that dropped close to that game's launch, where those spoilers were significant and fundamentally could change how you experienced the game as you played. In the case of this game, Professor Fig is so underdeveloped that it's really not that big of a deal, which I think says a lot. We also have Professor Aesop Sharp, who's one of the more interesting teachers, at least to me. He seems very Professor Snape-esque. But again, we barely see him through the whole game. There really isn't much to say about him, because we see him in like 2 to 3 missions, and that's about it. At the end, we also see him, but super, super underutilized. Other than that, we also have Dina Hecate, who is the professor for Defense Against the Dark Arts. She's super sweet, but again, very, very underutilized. We barely see her after the first few hours of the game. We also have Mirabelle Garlick, the professor of herbology, and I know what everybody's thinking. Everybody wanted romance options in this game. You're a child. Stop asking. Real quick, my wife, she was super bummed that there weren't romance options in the game. And she was like, there's a bunch of other games where you play as students and you can have like relationships and romances. You can even say like Persona 5 that I mentioned earlier, you're a student and you can have relationships with other students. So it doesn't have to be like some weird perverted thing. But people asking for romance options with the teachers, come on. Come on. I get it. You're all in for that herbology biscuit. Like, you're all into it. But like, come on, man. Come on. You're a child in this game and you're going after the teacher. You're a player, but I mean, come on. Let's get it together. In all seriousness, though, I do think a relationship system probably would have fixed the problem with a lot of these secondary characters feeling underdeveloped, because you'd have people that are trying so desperately to like romance various characters that they would get to know them, they'd get to learn what they like. You could even set up a gifting system like in Stardew Valley, where certain things you find out in the world or that you can craft, these characters really love, and it can increase their friendship rank with you. There's a whole system for companionship that they could put into a sequel to fix a lot of these problems with secondary characters falling so flat. So I think that they probably will do something like that in the future. It seems like a slam dunk, but I don't think they should add a romance system for teachers. I'm saying that now, putting my foot down. No, stop it. Beyond this, we have Abraham Ronan, who is a goofy, silly guy who is also extremely underutilized. I was looking forward to getting to see a lot more of him, but again, he disappears after the introductory section of the game, which is a big, big bummer. We also have Cutbirth Binns, who's the professor of the history of magic. You do a side quest with him. No love lost there. He's super boring and uninteresting to me. I'm not that upset that we don't see much of him. We also have Bao Hoen, who is the professor of beasts, also pretty underutilized. She could have been really, really fun to get to know a little bit more. We have Chiyo Kogawa, who's the professor of flying. Again, very underutilized after the initial tutorial, mainly because there's no Quidditch in this game, so you have no reason to see her after the initial tutorial. She would be a great character to explore more in a sequel, especially if they bring Quidditch back into the fold. She could be like the main head honcho that you go to connect with for all of those missions and tournaments and things, so she probably will have a role to play in the sequel pretty heavily, in my opinion. After that, we have Modiwa Onai? Modiwa Onai? I'm sorry, everybody just says Professor Onai. I don't know. I'm sorry. But she is the professor of divination, the mother of Natsai, of course. And we get to see a little bit more of her than other teachers, specifically in emotionally charged situations with Natsai. So we get to see her a little bit more, but I wouldn't say it's like endearing moments. It's moments where she's trying to be like a mother and in charge of her daughter. And I just don't think it puts her in the best light with the player, because we're going to take Natsai's side on all of this. So she's seen kind of as the controlling one, but you know what? At least we get to see more of her. Next, we have Satyavatai Shah, the professor of astronomy. She is cool, but again, disappears after the first few hours of the game, which is a bit of a bummer in my humble opinion. And then we have Agnes Scribner, who's the head librarian. Again, very, very underutilized. We barely see anything about her. And Gladwin Moon, who's the caretaker, who you'll be seeing a little bit of later in the game. Now, to be clear, I'm not insisting that we get to know every single one of these characters super, super well. But what the purpose of this little demonstration and photo lineup is simply to say that of all these characters, hardly any of them do you get to know even a little well throughout the course of the game. And it's because every relationship, every encounter is superficial. It's all wrapped in this cellophane story, and that's it. There is no chance to get to know these characters better, even if you want to, beyond like, I guess, doing external research, reading a ton of individual letters, imagining things. And it's a bit of a bummer because there's a lot of really interesting characters here who have fascinating backgrounds and things to offer, but you just don't get to know anything about them. In a moment, when we talk about classes, I'm going to propose a solution to the problem with professors that I think could fix it. But more than anything, I think how you fix most of the relationships with other students in various houses is simply to instigate either a relationship system and or a system for companionship, where you're able to take different characters out on missions with you, where they can level up, where they can increase their companionship score with you, similar to what you would see in like a Fire Emblem Three Houses, for example. And there's plenty of ways that you could do that pretty easily in a sequel. A relationship system, of course, being a great way to introduce bonding and companionship with different characters. And you could even tie that into the companionship system, where as they get a better relationship with you, romantic or not, even if it's just friendship related, then you could also see that translate into improved performance in battle, where they are going to be more defensive of you, maybe less aggressive on the front end, but more defensive of you, offering support spells, things like that. It could be fascinating how they do this, and I think there's tons of potential. So we'll have to just wait and see what they do in a sequel, but I think that there's plenty of runway here. Now, of all of these characters, as I mentioned before, the three that you will without a doubt grow closest to are Natty or Natsai, Sebastian, and Poppy. And that's because they have long quest lines tied to each of them. But you will notice there's no quest line dedicated to Ravenclaw. And that's because it was seemingly cut shortly before the game came out. And this was something that was rumored before the game released, that the house-specific quest for Ravenclaw had been slashed towards the end of development. They just decided to cut that. I don't know why they decided to cut that instead of the others. Maybe it was because it was the most broken or lacking in polish. Maybe it's simply because they did some number analysis and they found that Ravenclaw was the least popular house. I honestly don't know why they cut it, but there's only 3, though there were supposed to be 4. Also, what did I do to my eye? I got something in it. It's like very red and it burns. I'm dying. It reminds me of like 2 years ago, I was doing a video and I was filming just like this. I was just talking to the camera. And then I looked over in the monitor and my eye was like red, like blood red all the way across. I was like, oh, what is happening? And I turns out I had popped a blood vessel in my eye. And so it was just red with like my pupil. It was bizarre and I looked horrifying. And I was like, I can't put this video out now. So I like stopped the recording. I went upstairs and I'm freaking out. I'm Googling like crazy to figure out what's wrong with me. And after like a few days, it went away. I just didn't release a video. I kind of wish I had saved the recording from that time, because you just see me like filming, talking about a video game, having a great time. And then all of a sudden I turn and I'm like, I just freak out. It's awesome. But what are you going to do? Hopefully that doesn't happen with this. I'd like to finish this video. Maybe it'd be cool. Maybe if I pop a blood vessel, it'll be like really, really cool. I'll do that as the thumbnail, like just a blood eye or something. I don't know. Anyway, TMI. That was a bit of a diatribe. What was I saying? Oh yeah, the three friends. For me personally, as I mentioned, I felt closest to Sebastian by the end of the game. His questline's very, very long, and it's fairly emotional with him trying to find a cure for his sister by any means necessary. Really, any means necessary, even learning the unforgivable curses which can lead him to Azkaban if you choose to turn him in at the end of the questline. I will say, as I mentioned earlier, I decided to play as a Ravenclaw, making the worst decisions possible. So when I was prompted at the end of Sebastian's questline, after he's used Avada Kedavra and Crucio and done every terrible thing you could think of in an effort to save his sister, I chose not to turn him in because I felt like that was the bad choice. But my wife, Nikki, she chose to turn him in. And at the end of the game, when you do that, you can have one final conversation with him where it's revealed he's looking like he's going to be investigated by the ministry and potentially go to Azkaban, which he probably will. We don't get to see that. It's not like he disappears. It's not like we get a letter from him in Azkaban or anything. But it's heavily suggested he's going bye-bye. So I'll give him credit where credit's due. There is a consequence seemingly for Sebastian's actions, though consequences for the player doing those exact same things, except far, far more, are less significant. But again, we'll talk more about consequences for the dark arts later. Poppy's questline is pretty straightforward as it's focused on animals and centaurs, and I found it pretty interesting, though she's far less of the focus in the questline as the animals are. She's sweet and nice, but she doesn't really stand out as a character to me, and I felt as though, again, the focus was on the things you're doing and not on her as a character in the context of these activities, whereas Sebastian's questline is about him and his sister trying to solve this problem by any means necessary. And as for Nutsai's questline, this one's pretty straightforward, with her basically trying to get a jump on Theophilus Harlow, who's Victor Rookwood's right-hand man. Again, remember I said that we don't really get to see anything of Rookwood? Well, like, even here, we're going after his right-hand man, and like Rookwood's like just not there. It's just, instead of going after Rookwood, we're going after his right-hand man, and it's just dark wizards. And that's it. It's just underwhelming. Like, they could have tied him more into this, but instead it's just like, oh, he's his right-hand man. Just deal with it. Forget about it. Forget about it. And I would say this is a second place to Sebastian's questline in terms of character building, as we get to learn a lot about Natty, about the death of her father and how this forced them to move to Hogwarts from where they were originally. We get to see Natty discuss the grief of her father's death and tell you that she wants to bring down Harlow so she can find some modicum of peace to help her move on from her father's death, something that makes her very sympathetic and something that makes you want to go and help her. And this is great. These are the questlines that I would like to see built out more in the next game. Stuff like Nutsai's quest and Sebastian's quest, where there's an emotional core at the center of the quest, where the characters are thrust into this difficult situation where they're conflicted over what they should do. And as you go through the quest line, you're struggling as well with what you should do or shouldn't do. Should you help Nutsai kill Harlow? In this case, you have to. There isn't really a choice. Should you help Sebastian go through the quest line and save his sister, even if it means he learns the unforgivable curses? You don't have to learn the curses, but you do have to help him go through this if you're going to complete the quest, so you just kind of deal with it. But either way, you're conflicted as to what you should do, whether you should encourage this activity or if you should go along with it begrudgingly. But all along, you're learning more about these characters and the things that emotionally drive them. And that makes Sebastian stand out as a character, that makes Nutsai stand out as a character, and it would make Poppy stand out as a character, though again, as I said, I think her questline is much more about the activities you're doing and much less about her. There aren't a ton of really interesting conversations with her that focus on her and her emotional motivations for things. Most of it's tied up in just, well, poachers are bad. We need to save the creatures. And that's about it. And quick, costume change. Woo! Boom! Costume change. Now, we've touched on it a few times, but I think it's just about time we fully tackle the Hogwarts recreation. For this game, Hogwarts has been recreated 1-to-1. I mean, it's honestly kind of insane how well they've done here. And they've also added areas that we never saw in the films, that we haven't seen in other games, and that were barely mentioned in the books, and even some areas that are entirely new. Hallways that you would have only thought could be there. And I know for a fact that a lot of people were playing Hogwarts Legacy for this exact reason. They said to me, word for word, I don't care if the game sucks, just as long as I can explore Hogwarts, I will be happy spending $70 on it. And that, I think, is very important to remember. For a lot of people, this game was more about escaping to Hogwarts and living out that fantasy. Whether or not the game around it was good didn't really matter. And more than anything, I think that just serves as attestation to the power of the Harry Potter franchise. This world, this school, is so important to so many people because it was such an integral part of their childhood that it really can't be understated. First things first, I mean, the school looks gorgeous from the outside and on the inside. The only problems that you will regularly run into are specifically related to performance. And most of these performance issues are tied up in the load screens and specifically the data streaming system within the game. The data streaming system is basically just a fancy way of saying how the game loads areas in as you explore the castle. So when you walk through that doorway, you see something here that wasn't loaded in when you were across the room. This is how they can save memory and make sure that things are fluid, and this is also why it's so hard to port these games to last-gen consoles like the PS4 and Xbox One, because those consoles had significantly less memory, so it's much harder to keep all of these things on screen at the same time or to prepare them as you move from area to area. And this tech is really, really hard to get right. It's one of the reasons I've actually praised Ubisoft in the past, because they have some of the best data streaming tech in the industry within their proprietary engine that they use for the Assassin's Creed games. The fact that you can just have your bird partner for that particular game fly up across the entire game map, and then when you press one button, you zip right back to the main character is absolutely insane. The fact that they can load things in that quickly. And honestly, it just in general feels like Hogwarts Legacy is a tad behind where it needs to be in terms of processing data in and out. I've been running this game off of my monster PC, which, by the way, if you're interested in a pre-built PC that is phenomenal, use the guys that I use. I have a link in my link tree below. Apex Gaming PCs, they do phenomenal work. They built this for me, and I can't recommend them highly enough. And also, if you decide to get your PC through that link in the link tree, you'll also be supporting me and the stream and the channel and everything else we do here. So little plug for you. But the point is, I'm running this on this monster PC. The game is running off of the highest end and fastest M.2 NVMe SSD that I could find for this computer. And even on PlayStation 5 with their internal hard drive, where I've also tested the game, it still has loading issues. What that should tell you is that the performance issues here are not specifically relegated or related in and of themselves to the speed of the hardware, whether it's running off of a hard drive, an SSD, or what have you, but rather it's a problem within the software in how it's processing the data, bringing it in and queuing it up as you move throughout the castle. But that's actually good news because it means that these things can be patched and altered as we move forward. That's exactly what we want. Hopefully, as time goes by, maybe in 6 months when you're watching this video, you will be like, oh, there aren't any problems. When you walk up to doors, there aren't loading circles or delays or hitches whenever you pass through certain thresholds. And that's hopefully what's happening. I don't know if that's going to happen, but seeing that this is something that happens across platforms and hardware makes me think it's more of a software issue. So my hope is that they can fix it. But even then, when there are hitches and when these little loading circles pop up in front of doors, the castle is still fun to explore. Is it ideal? No, not at all. I really wish they would have figured this out and gotten rid of them, especially on high-end devices like a PS5 and a brand new PC. But you know what? The game is still functional. So even if it's a little rough around the edges, I can forgive that so long as the rest of it holds up. But so long as you're able to look past those technical issues, there is a ton of stuff to see within the castle. All sorts of weird little discoveries to be made, rooms to explore, classrooms and classes to attend. There's just a ton. Now, I will say that while there is a lot to explore here, the game gets off to a really slow start. As I mentioned earlier, for some people this will be great and give them an excuse to explore the castle grounds with a little bit more direction than they would have otherwise gotten. And for others, like me, it might be a little bit frustrating. But when you're actually within the classrooms, I think, is when the game feels much more like a Harry Potter title than anything else. In the opening hours, you'll be tasked with attending certain classes, and within the classes, you'll be tasked with completing various activities that are in the theme of the classroom you are within. This might be collecting certain plants, brewing a certain potion, or learning the basics of broom flight. However, as I mentioned before, it kind of ends there. You attend 1 or 2 or maybe 3 classes with each professor. A few of them you'll have recurring scenes with, but it's usually not related to classwork in and of itself. And so it creates this weird feeling where after the first 5 to 6 hours, your time as a student largely is over. It'll completely shift as a game, and it'll start to feel much more like an adventure game than a Hogwarts student game, if that makes sense. And I think this would have been relatively easy to fix, especially with some inspiration taken from one of my favorite cult classic games, Bully. And I actually think the developers took inspiration from Bully initially when designing this out. I mean, it only makes sense, right? Like if you're gonna have a game about students in a school, why not take inspiration from a game that has students in a school and is beloved by many, many millions of people? And part of the reason I think that is because there are remnants of Bully DNA throughout this game, especially in the opening hours, but it looks as though a lot of those systems were probably cut. Systems like having a curfew for the player to engage with, where you can only attend classes during a certain time of day, and where teachers patrol the hallways at night to make sure you're actually in bed doing your bits and bops. This is something which is obviously signaled in the Alohomora quest, where you have to navigate through like a specific area of the castle where teachers are and where prefects hang out, and it's built around stealth, which seems to be one of the few occasions where stealth is actually necessary while exploring. And I think that this was clearly an opportunity where at night you could have it so you could explore Hogwarts, especially because a couple of these quest lines require you to find objects at night because they only appear at night. And you could tie that in with this system of stealth where you have to avoid teachers' gazes while exploring the castle in order to find these items so that you can unlock more difficult locks and things. There's so much potential here, but the curfew system is relegated to this tiny, tiny system and tiny quest over here, and it's just really odd. In all likelihood, they probably experimented with this and found that a lot of people just didn't find it super fun to go through the open world and then have to go all the way back to your common room every night in order to like save and load into the next game. So they just found that it was easier to just open it up and let players do whatever and just not really talk about it. But I'll be honest, I think a lot of games actually thrive on instilling a little bit of structure, and this doesn't actually prevent you from eventually opening it up. You could have it so in the first 10 hours or so of the game, you have to adhere to that curfew very, very strictly. And then maybe at a certain point in the game's story, the ministry comes and is like, hey, you're really good at doing what you're doing. We're going to need your help. And then they give you some pass that makes it so you can explore the castle grounds and the surrounding areas freely without cause for fear of repercussions, just totally opening it up to the player. Yeah, it would be a little contrived, but I personally prefer that to just blindly ignoring it, which seems to be the policy in general for Avalanche with some of these more difficult topics of game design. Like with the unforgivable curses, they just don't talk about it. Potential repercussions for killing tons of people in the game, just don't talk about it. Breaking curfew, don't talk about it. Barely ever being at the castle, don't talk about it. They just ignore it, go to your happy space, don't think about it too hard, have fun, and ignore all of that stuff. I think that a sequel really could play around with a little bit more structure, and I think it actually probably would make the game feel more realistic and grounded, and I think that would help people's immersion even more. And I will say I've spoken to a handful of people over on stream who have come into the chat and expressed frustration with Hogwarts Legacy because they were hoping it would be much more of a student simulator akin to something like Persona 5 than what they got, which is a student simulation game for the first 5 hours that then transforms into an open world adventure game and then ignores all of the student stuff that happened before. Regardless, going back to the Bully example, I think that there would be many opportunities to ensure that players were fully immersed in the life of a student within Hogwarts. You could have systems where players have to build out a schedule of classes and then attend those classes and perform various activities within mini-games in order to maximize their XP payout to make them better at certain types of activities. Just like in Bully, the example here would be you need to go to potions class and brew a handful of potions in the right order with a given mini game or something that makes it more engaging and fun. And if you do that well, you'll get more bonus points into your potion crafting, which makes you more efficient at it, or maybe gives you a perk so your potions are more effective than they would be otherwise. Or in the case of something like Defense Against the Dark Arts class, that's how you could level up your spells so you deal more damage because you're getting better at very precisely moving your wand properly or whatever else. This would mean that even 10-15 hours into the game, you could find yourself going back into Hogwarts to attend classes so that you can continue leveling up and improving. And I think it would help a lot with immersion, because then you'd actually be playing as a student going to classes instead of as a student that goes to classes 2 or 3 times and then just totally blows everything else off. And maybe I'm alone in this, but I personally always found it a little bit strange when somebody like Professor Weasley would come up to me and be like, oh, you need to prepare for your owl exams. And you're like, oh, right, that thing, because I'm a student, right. I haven't done anything related to being a student in like 25 hours of gameplay, but okay, I guess it always just bugged me a little. And I think in a sequel, if they doubled down on those features of Bully that made that feel like a fun adventure game, but also one that simulates the life of a student within a boarding school in America, I think it could be really, really interesting. One of the other cool things that they added to the school was, of course, the Room of Requirement. And the way they handled this was actually pretty interesting, and it ended up being a lot more expansive than I was ready for, if I'm being completely honest. Not only do they have a vivarium where you can breed different animals, which is a decent way, roughly, of creating revenue and income for yourself in the late game, where you can breed animals and then sell them off. It works. I wish they paid better, especially if you're breeding like very difficult to find animals. You'd think that they would pay out better, but you know what? It is what it is. Of course, you can also farm and grow various plants that are used in combat, which we'll discuss later, or that can be used within potion crafting. And speaking of potions, you can also craft stations where you can brew all sorts of potions to help with combat, exploration, and the like. One frustration I have, which I think is also pretty easily patched, and it might have been patched by the time you're seeing this video, is the fact that within the potions UI at launch, and as of right now, there is no indication of how many potions you currently have in your inventory. So in all likelihood, you'll craft like 15 of a specific potion because you're like, yeah, I'll just load up all of my stations with this one potion so I can maximize it and I'll just move on from there. However, you soon find out that you only have room for 7 of those. So now you have 8 that you just don't need and you destroy them and it's just kind of a waste. It's really, really frustrating. If they had a system within the UI of this potion crafting station where they actually show you, okay, right here, okay, I have 7 of this potion, so I can craft 8 more. Okay, I'll fill up 8 stations and do it that way. That's all I'm asking for. That would be super, super helpful. I know a lot of other people didn't really use the potion crafting system. I actually know one guy who played on hard and didn't use the potions at all. He's like, oh, you can do that in the Room of Requirement? I just thought that was like for the healing potion. He had no idea. No idea. Got through the whole game, had no idea. And beyond that, there's tons of customization for the Room of Requirement, so you can make it look and feel pretty much however you like, even down to the ambient lighting, which you can change. This was like a really interesting sort of Animal Crossing meets Harry Potter crossover that I was not ready for. And I would guess that this is one of those things that they decided to add while cutting Quidditch. They were like, okay, we can't do the Room of Requirement thing that we want to do if we also have Quidditch. There's just not enough time. So they decided to cut Quidditch and put this in the game. And honestly, I think this is probably more interesting in the long run, but I could see some people being frustrated they chose this over that. But you know what? You can't have it all. And I just have to show you guys this. This is something I saw on the subreddit of the game. It's a guy who goes into the Room of Requirement and he just decorated the entire thing with various dead house elf heads, which for some reason is a customization option in the game. You can actually just put house elf heads on the walls, and it's a little unsettling when you see it like this with just an entire wall of elves that have just been murdered. Like it's really, really uncomfortable. But you know what? I admire the creativity. This is something I wouldn't have thought to do myself. Props. But one of the things you cannot avoid talking about when it comes to Hogwarts Castle and the early hours of the game is Revelio. Revelio is one of the most commonly complained about things with regards to Hogwarts Legacy, and I think it's for good reason. The only time the spell feels actually useful is when you spam it relentlessly while exploring Hogwarts Castle or going through quest areas with obscure objectives. It's basically this game's version of the Witcher sense in The Witcher 3 or detective mode in the Arkham games. It sounds really useful on paper, but in practice it just leads to the player wandering around trying to spam it until they are close enough to the target object for it to appear or be more visible. This type of player assistance is common in a lot of games, but basically it's a tool that developers give to the player to help them navigate the world, making interactable objects stand out more clearly, or by pointing out enemies behind walls or obstructed areas of view, the player can have an easier time of engaging in combat. It's generally a good thing, and I think the positives and benefits generally outweigh the negatives, even if it could stand to get a little bit more balance in the form of less frequent mandated use. A great example of games that have toned down these systems while keeping them useful would be the shift in detective mode in Batman Arkham City from Batman Arkham Asylum, where they made the view less helpful so that players were discouraged from using it permanently through the entire game, which was certainly an issue with the original Batman Arkham Asylum game. In other words, you don't want these detective modes to be too useful, otherwise players will just spam them and then get frustrated that they're spamming them all the time. As I've said before, if a player has the ability to spam some feature or item or gameplay mechanic, they will. It's why I don't really like quick save options within narrative RPGs, because what happens is players will basically spam quick save right before a major decision is made so that they can quickly reload if they make the wrong one, or if there's some sort of stat check where you have to have persuasion above this point, otherwise there's only an 8% chance that it goes through. So you quick save, try it, 8%. Oh, you failed. Well, quick load, try it again. Oh, you failed. Quick load, try it again. I passed. I got the 8% chance thing to happen. Wow, so cool. And they'll move on through the game from there. It's just one of those things that's given to the player. Yeah, use it if you want. But if players have the ability, almost always they will, and then they'll complain and be frustrated that the game doesn't feel right because they have this system that's too powerful and that then makes the rest of it not fun. So I think Revelio would be greatly improved if they made it so it was perhaps a single button press that casts Revelio that then lasts and permeates for maybe 10 seconds. So you don't have to constantly just go Revelio, 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 as you walk around a room trying to find where the missing guide page is. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I've seen a handful of TikToks from people who are very frustrated at how often they were forced to use Revelio. You know, people posting videos where it's like, oh, my expectation for Hogwarts Legacy, and it's this big magical dragon fight or something, and then they cut to what it actually is. Revelio, Revelio, Revelio. And that surely is what the game feels like for the first few hours, and even later if you start hunting down guide pages, it's going to feel like that again. Now, they also did a tremendous job recreating Hogsmeade. I will say it's initially tons of fun to explore Hogsmeade, but later in the game, after you've visited for the 50th time, not being allowed to fly within its grounds gets increasingly frustrating. There were many times when I just wanted to hop on my broom, zip around to the other side of Hogsmeade to go to a different shop, but instead I had to slowly walk on foot all the way across and through the streets just to get over there. It was needlessly frustrating. And also, Hogsmeade is a pretty big presence on the map. If you're navigating the northeastern section of the game's map, you probably need to go around or through Hogsmeade, and that gets really frustrating. No matter how high you are above the ground, you can't fly over Hogsmeade with your broom. So you end up running into these invisible walls whenever you get close to it, which ends up being, again, just a little frustrating. And for me, it's also immersion breaking to be exploring the world and then hit a big invisible wall. I get you could maybe justify, oh, it's a magical wall to keep magic out of Hogsmeade because we don't want that to be there because then things might go bad. But like even then, it's just, it feels contrived and it doesn't change the fact that it feels frustrating. What isn't frustrating is just how useful Hogsmeade ends up being. I'm glad that they gave us a reason to return to Hogsmeade repeatedly throughout the game in the form of these shops with blueprints, clothes, places where you can sell your beasts that you've collected or upgrade your broom. Throughout all of my time with Hogwarts Legacy, I have repeatedly returned to Hogsmeade consistently in order to perform various tasks and activities. And again, I'm really happy about this because because I was fearful that we wouldn't actually have a reason to return after we initially explored the village during a story mission of some sort. But seeing that they actually kept it useful so you continually return, I thought was pretty cool. I would say, however, that they should have taken a page out of their own book and done the same kind of thing with Hogwarts. They sort of did in the form of the Room of Requirement, so that you could go there to craft potions and improve your equipment with various upgrades and things that we'll talk about in a little bit. But it still doesn't feel like Hogwarts because you can just fast travel directly to the Room of Requirement. So it doesn't really feel like part of Hogwarts. It's like a separate thing that you can load into completely separately. So I guess you could spin it and say, well, they did make it so you have to return to Hogwarts. But instead, I think it should be counted as its own thing, basically. If they made it so you couldn't fast travel directly into the Room of Requirement, but rather you could fast travel to your house room, and then from there you had to walk to the Room of Requirement, I think that could actually work and make it feel like you're in Hogwarts a lot more than you actually are. But I digress. Again, it's just a broad frustration that after the first few hours, you don't have a whole lot of reason to go back to Hogwarts, and the story actively pushes you out of the castle. But with all that being said, after a little while, we get access to the broom, exploration opens up more broadly into the rest of the map, and we're allowed to just go crazy. And this is where the game, for me, changed at a foundational level. It no longer was about living life as a student. It was about exploring as a wizard or witch in this Harry Potter themed world. And it honestly was pretty fun. And I have a lot to say about it. We're about to get into the world design. We're going to talk about the combat. We're going to talk about broom races, broom upgrades, all sorts of crazy stuff with stats and spreadsheets. So buckle up. But first, of course, I need to do a quick costume change because I didn't time this filming session very well, so I've already run out of time. I'm a professional. But okay, I'll see you in a second. Spin move! There you go. Okay, oh goodness. Okay, yes, it's been a long period of time since the last session of filming. I am a bit of a mess, but we're gonna keep going and wrap this up, hopefully once and for all in this last take. And you know what? Let's just get into it. By the way, it's got to be weird watching these critiques that take like weeks of iterative filming and reshoots and stuff, because like the camera angles change all the time because I can never be satisfied with how I have things set up. The microphones change, stuff just constantly is swapping around. So I apologize for that. But at the very least, it's probably interesting to see how many times I change the studio over the course of the production of one big video. So maybe that's cool. But okay, let's talk about Hogwarts Legacy and some of the aspects of the game that change once it opens up into that, what I guess you could call the second main act, which is where you get access to the broom. You can fly around, do whatever you want. Curfew's not a thing. There aren't strict class schedules. You can just go do whatever you want. Now, once you get access to the broom, I would say that navigation generally is very, very enjoyable. Flying around on your broom is actually far more engaging and interesting than I thought it would be. I was braced for a super clunky control system with super aggressive invisible walls all over the place, preventing you from exploring the castle walls or the areas above the castle or underneath the castle. But all told, the broom is very responsive. The upgrades you can get from the local shop in Hogsmeade, while not super robust, do in fact make a difference when you compare the top speeds and the movement late in the game to when you start. And once you get the hang of moving around with the broom, you can really start zipping around in a way that's super satisfying. Don't get me wrong, there are still tons of invisible walls, or should I say not so invisible walls, around the map to prevent you from exploring outside bounds, but I also understand that these are a necessary evil, because a game like this cannot be expected to provide you the entirety of Scotland to explore. At some point, they have to draw the line somewhere and not allow your broom to carry you over the mountaintops and along the shore. In other words, I get it, why they have to have invisible walls here, but I don't love it. As I mentioned, it's right around this time that you'll start actively exploring the map to your heart's content, doing whatever you want. You can focus on the main story, but a lot of players will likely spend a few hours just dicking around. Upon doing so, you will quickly realize that Hogwarts Legacy is packed tight with things to do and discover. A lot of it is indeed repetitive, such as the Merlin puzzles and various animal dens with a lot of copy and pasted layouts, but even still, I found myself enjoying exploration across the board. By the time I reached hours 50 to 60, I was certainly starting to get fatigued, however. There's only so many enemy encampments mounts that you can clear before it starts to feel old, especially when there's very little incentive to do it in terms of gameplay and upgrades to armor. Now, over the course of the game, you're going to get access to all sorts of different broom upgrades. As I mentioned before, you can also change out mounts, and you get access at the end of the game to the Graphorn, which is the big lizardy monster dog thing, which you can ride. Now, my impression, as I've alluded to before, was that the mounts are very, very useless in comparison to the broom. It just never felt as though they flew any faster. They were useful in combat. They could get to places that the broom couldn't. There really was no reason to use the mounts at all compared to just using your broom, which begs the question, why are they here other than just potentially clipping interesting screenshots and making the trailers look cooler? And after getting access to the data mine stats, this suspicion has all but been confirmed. As you can see here, the original broom goes from 1700 to 1800, 1900, and then 2000 in terms of overall top speed. And the mounts sit at 1800. The problem is that 99% of players will only get access to mounts after they've purchased the first broom upgrade as part of that quest. So players will never know a time when their broom performed any worse than the mounts, at least in terms of top speed. And this again to me just proves the point that the mounts really are kind of useless. They're just here for eye candy, and that's about it, which is why players will use them for probably 5 minutes, 10 minutes maybe for a flight or two, and after that it's just not very viable, so they'll just go back to what they were doing before. I don't think there's any shame in that. I don't think there's any problem in that. And honestly, if you can't put something in a game just because it looks cool or feels cool, then like, what are we doing? Like, what's the point of all of this? I think it's totally fine to have a feature or a mechanic in a game that's used a little bit and then moved on. I can say that it's maybe underutilized, which I think the mounts definitely are. I can even spitball some ideas to make them more useful, such as having the mounts able to get to higher reaches, so perhaps they can go up in elevation above where the broom could be stable. So that could encourage you to have all sorts of like mountain peak exclusive discoveries or collectibles and things that you can only get to with the mounts. Things like that could make them useful, at least in exploration. But unfortunately, even when you're just flying through the world, there's no reason to use a mount other than just for it to look different. And that's what's also, again, affirmed in all of the stats related to top speed with the mount, top speed with the brooms fully upgraded. There's just no reason to do it. And as you see, as you level up the broom, you also get a bigger height for when you can do the maximum infinite boost thing, where that yellow bar is maximized and it doesn't run out. And so as you upgrade the broom, even the potential benefit of a mount being better max speed at higher heights, even that's actively diminished because they make the broom overly useful even at those high heights. So I understand what they were trying to do. Players are going to use the broom more often anyways. It's more agile, but I think it could have been really, really cool to make the mounts more useful. And in the sequel, I think there's a ton of potential even for integrating these things into combat, especially because they have the breeding system with the Room of Requirement, where you can actually breed the animals you've collected into bigger and stronger animals, at least in theory, which could lead to all sorts of really interesting game mechanics where you have two very, very strong thestrals, and so you breed them together and you get an even more powerful one, and perhaps there's a random drop percentage for it to get an ability that's particularly aggressive, or it can inflict bleeding or some sort of effect like that. And you could really make it an active thing where you are breeding your creatures and your mounts to be more useful in combat. There could be individual spells to call them in, and maybe they just come out of nowhere, scratch up somebody, and then get back out of combat. All sorts of cool things you could do, and I think it would be at least something compared to the nothing in terms of justifications for the mounts existing. But beyond mere exploration, what are you actually exploring? Is the world worth seeing and navigating? Well, there's a lot to say here. The first thing I want to touch on that particularly perturbs me are the Merlin puzzles. These are highly repetitive activities wherein you are expected to complete a brief puzzle that usually constitutes a few basic actions, like leading fireflies to a series of rocks that will hold them, or going and blowing up a couple of statues, or igniting a few bowls of kerosene. It's pretty straightforward. It's never particularly difficult, and it's always just time consuming. These are clearly this game's version of the Korok seeds from Breath of the Wild. Not only are there a lot of them, and not only do I think you're not supposed to complete all of them, but also these are what are between you and an actual usable inventory size. You see, in order to upgrade your inventory to be able to carry more things so you don't have to constantly go to the Hogsmeade shops to sell stuff off or just outright destroy it, you need to complete these Merlin trials, and as you complete them, you'll reach certain thresholds. It might be 3, might be 6, might be 12, but as you go along and complete more chunks of them, you'll unlock a larger inventory capacity so that, again, you don't have to go with the busy work of unlocking more slots so that you don't have to go back into town all the time. And again, this is exactly how the Korok seeds worked in Breath of the Wild, so the inspiration is pretty clear. My biggest frustration with these are that they simply aren't fun. I will acknowledge that this is purely subjective. I don't find these things fun, and I completed every single one in the game. Like, I've tried them all, literally, and I don't find them very fun at all. I didn't find them fun after 5 hours. I certainly didn't find them fun after 65 hours. I don't find them fun. They are built with the same basic tools. Many of them are just straight up repeats where it's just lighting bowls in different arrangements or going and blowing up statues scattered around a couple of different things. It's really, really tedious. And while you could say the same thing about the Korok seeds, that, oh, it's just move a rock over here and boom, you completed the puzzle. The difference with the Korok seeds is that there were 900 of those in Breath of the Wild, and the developers knew that you probably were only going to be completing 200 of them over the course of a multiple dozens of hours playthrough of the game, and you would only be completing them if you stumbled on them while out in the world. There weren't map markers for them. They weren't something that you were told to go and complete. It's just something that would occur where you're running around the world and then you see a pile of rocks. It's built into a pyramid shape, and then there's one circular rock laying to the side. So you pick it up, set it on top to complete the shape, and boom, you solved the puzzle. It was dynamic, it was simple, it was kind of fun and satisfying because you saw something out of order in the world, you fixed it, put it in order, and then you get rewarded for it. Whereas in Hogwarts Legacy, these puzzles are just overly tedious, they aren't enjoyable or satisfying, and the cherry on top of all of it is that the thing that compels you to engage with these, the limited inventory capacity, it's so terrible, especially at the start of the game, that you will be actively chasing down these Merlin puzzles in order to increase your inventory capacity, and because they aren't fun, it feels all the more like a grind, and it's just miserable. It really is. I think they probably could have saved this by, one, not marking the Merlin puzzles on the map at all. Embrace the Korok seed inspiration fully instead of just halfway. Take them off the minimap, don't make it part of the completionist vibe of the game, and instead just have players complete them as they explore and find them around. This is something I think that they maybe initially intended to do because the player character will constantly say, "Oh, what a pleasant surprise," whenever he runs into a puzzle out in the world, even though you can see it on the minimap. You might have been headed directly to it because your inventory's full and you're sick of it, so you're grinding out those for an hour of gameplay or something. And so he implies that it's a fun little treat to find one of these things, even though it really isn't. But if they had removed it from the minimap and instead kept it as just an organic thing that happens and that you find as you explore the world, I think players would be much better served so long as their inventory capacity was larger so that they didn't feel the need to grind these out. In Breath of the Wild, if you ever felt like your inventory was really small, you could, I guess, try to go out and grind Korok seeds, but in the process of trying to grind Korok seeds, you'd also discover all sorts of shrines, you'd discover all sorts of enemy encampments and other things to keep you busy and to pull your interest away. In a lot of ways, because the Korok seeds were so densely packed in the world, you would usually just find enough of them while exploring that you reached a point where you were comfortable with your inventory and you just stopped caring about the Korok seed puzzles. So whenever you saw that stack of stones or you saw something weird out of alignment, you just said, I'm good. My inventory's good. And you just keep running. And that's a much better situation for the player to be in, to have so much inventory space after completing all those puzzles that they don't feel the need to grind. However, I think that the lack of inventory size from the beginning of the game was very, very intentional. The chief reason for it, I think, is because they wanted to make sure the player was constantly encouraged to return to Hogsmeade, which is a place they put a lot of effort into so that they could sell items, which gives them income so they can buy other upgrades or blueprints, whatever else they need. In other words, encouraging them not to just destroy items they don't need, but rather to take these and actively sell them as they play the game, and also because it would encourage them to return to the room of requirement and focus on upgrading the gear and getting rid of the old gear. So I'm not saying there wasn't a reason for the small inventory. I just think that they overextended and made the inventory so stupid small, especially at the start of the game, that players will actively be pounding their head against the wall in order to alleviate the suffering of dealing with this. It's so annoying to be playing an open world game, exploring, finding cool stuff, and then being forced to return to some place you just went to sell off all the stuff so that then you can fast travel back out into the world to keep doing the fun thing. I mean, this is a magical world. Why couldn't I just send like a magical letter to Sebastian and have him come pick up all the stuff I'm carrying in my inventory? This is something I will grant you is very subjective. I've always found it super annoying to be playing a game and then to have an arbitrary carry weight system force me back into a shop to sell it off. It's always triggered the crap out of me. I just can't stand this. So I'll leave it there. Otherwise I'll keep rambling. I just really, really don't like this type of thing. And I think in Hogwarts Legacy, this inventory system is one of the greatest offenses. And luckily it's an easy thing to fix for a sequel, but dear God, I hope they fix it because this is terrible. Last note on the Merlin puzzles though, I did run into a few of them over the course of my time with the game where I was able to cheese them or just straight break them by using spells I wasn't supposed to use. And there were a handful of occasions when I also had puzzles glitch out entirely because I was trying to use a skill or an ability I wasn't supposed to for the puzzle, and the puzzle wasn't robust enough in arrangement to withstand that, so I was able to break it. Such as this example here. A big thing for a ball. Hold on, I'm guessing with this ramp there's got to be a ball further up here that we can just roll into it, right? Like surely that's a thing. It's gonna be one of those Mervin puzzles. Sure doesn't.
Levioso.
Do you have anything else that might help with it? The Roloso spell. Do I have to push it like a human? Oh, now it's moving? I'm a wizard, an actual wizard. And I'm like, I'll just push this ball. That'll be fine. This is bullcrap. What? Dude! Huh. Something something tells me that that wasn't part of the puzzle. I'm starting to think that was not was supposed to happen. Yeah, pretty stupid, right? Okay, moving on. Some of the other events you can engage with while out in the open world would be, for example, butterflies, where you follow them back to a central point where they'll reveal a chest with some treasure in it. There's also all sorts of layers, like the troll layers, where you can fight a high-level enemy, which offers a fun combat challenge. I will say, towards the end of the game, I started really seeking these things out because I was getting really frustrated with how painfully easy the combat was becoming very, very quickly. So I really enjoyed these things. There's all sorts of animal dens where you can build a collection for your vivarium, and many, many more things. There's a lot to do in this world, and there's also a ton of really nice little touches as well if you're looking for them. My favorite was probably the tombstone at the back of Hagrid's hut, which I found to be just a super sweet touch because, of course, the actor who played Hagrid, Robbie Coltrane, passed away just before this game's release on October 14th of 2022. I don't know, I just found this really, really sweet, and I thought it was a great little addition, so props to the dev team. I thought this was great. There's also some other dynamic world events like the giant squid that you can come across if you're riding and flying across the lake, which I had happen a couple of times. Apparently it happened while I was playing on my Steam Deck because I don't have any footage of it, but it is something that happens and is super cool. However, I was not the only one that saw this. This YouTuber Velicor, maybe? I don't know. Posted this little video, Hogwarts Legacy Giant Squid. As you can see, you can look it up yourself as well. But he posted this one, and this is pretty much exactly what happened to me, and I just want to show you because it's pretty badass. So look at this. Basically exploring the lake and the surrounding areas, looking around, not doing anything too special, but decides to skip some rocks, and this happens. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. I will say for me, I had this happen while I was actually flying on my broom. And so the arms or tentacles, I guess, came up right as I was crossing over. So I basically flew through the arms. It was pretty cool. And there's a bunch of little touches like these, including little touches with dragons and all sorts of stuff that's just super fun. There's also a moment in Winter that I also saw when I was playing on my Steam Deck, so I don't have a clip of this either, where there's magical snowmen that you can come across. And if you attack the magical snowmen, they will actually come back and like attack you. It's super, super funny, but if you use a fire spell, then they actually melt, which is also just a great touch. There's tons of little attention to detail like that, which really makes the world stand out. But all these little touches would be totally wasted if the world weren't put together in a semi-coherent way. And it's a lot easier to just say, oh, make a good open world, than it is to actually do it. So what I did is I actually did some research. I pulled out a spreadsheet, I calculated a bunch of stuff, and I made a video on the 15-second rule of Hogwarts Legacy's open world design. I'm going to show you that video in just a second because that video, of course, I already made it, and I think it does a really, really good job of summarizing all of this stuff better than I could do just kind of on the fly here. So I'm going to play that video in just a moment. But I do want to let you know that I actually had one of the developers that worked on the open world design specifically of Hogwarts Legacy that works at Avalanche Games underneath Warner Brothers. And they reached out to me and said, I can't say exactly how we design stuff for obvious reasons, but let's just say you're very close. And apparently a bunch of people on the dev team actually saw that video, thought it was a really cool representation of how they put the world together. So I'm not just pulling this out of my butt. The actual people who made the game saw what you're about to see and went, yeah, that's basically it. So check it out. This is the 15-second rule of Hogwarts Legacy. I'll be real. I was expecting to be sort of disappointed by the open world aspects of this game because history has shown us that not many studios can pull off high quality and intriguing and captivating open world design. It's not easy at all, and especially not for studios that don't have a ton of experience in this type of thing. And remember, the developers of Hogwarts Legacy, their last game was Cars 3 Driven to Win, and before that they worked on like Disney Infinity and stuff. I had no idea that they were capable of something like this, so props everyone at Avalanche and Portkey. Like, seriously, this is impressive. But why is it impressive? What is so interesting about this, and why is the game so interesting and captivating to play? Have you ever wondered about that? Like, what makes an open world in a game like The Witcher 3 or Hogwarts Legacy? What makes that interesting and fun to explore, while another game like Forspoken or Assassin's Creed Valhalla could just fall so terribly flat? What makes it good and what makes it bad? Well, I've done a lot of research and careful calculations on this in years past for some of the biggest open world games that have ever released, such as The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, Breath of the Wild, Fallout New Vegas, all of the open world games that you know and love. I've done this experiment with. And basically the experiment is pretty simple, and it just serves as a test to verify something I saw in an article based on an interview with CD Projekt Red developers years ago. And you can see in this article from back in 2017, Derek Strickland interviewed some developers over at CDPR who worked on The Witcher 3 and learned from them what made the world of The Witcher 3 so engaging and captivating. Why did it feel fun to explore, and why didn't it get boring like so many other games? And what they said was, quote, "We did some tests and we found that the player is focused on the stuff which we produce. Every 40 seconds, they should see something and focus on it, like a pack of deer or some opponents, some NPCs wandering about. So we have our rule of 40 seconds. Pretty interesting, right? All they're saying is that they aim for roughly 40 seconds between moments of interest. And for whatever reason, according to their testing, games that are paced like that consistently tend to be more satisfying to play and less boring to play in the long run. In case that's not clear, basically what they'd be aiming for is between these 2 points, they want roughly 30 to 40 seconds worth of travel in between them. So as you leave this deserted gold, you move on, you're looking for something else to do, and you'll hit this one after about 30 to 40 seconds. Or if you go in this way, it's about 30 to 40 seconds. And you'll start to realize all of this stuff is very similarly distanced from each other. It's all very, very close in terms of space between them. And again, it's because they basically created a circle with the radius of 30 to 40 seconds worth of travel distance, and then they used that as a guide to design this open world and space things out in that satisfying way. And I've tested this with a ton of other games, like I said, and every single one of them that has a high quality open world to explore has very consistent timings between moments of interest as far as we've tested. Some games like Red Dead Redemption 2 are much longer, other games are much shorter and denser packed, but the games that have the highest quality and the most engaging open worlds are the most consistently paced ones. So I wanted to test this with Hogwarts Legacy and see if that's why the world of Hogwarts Legacy is so fun to explore and so easy to get lost within. And I had a couple of ideas as to how to do this. I thought, what if on stream I had my wife play a little bit and I didn't tell her exactly what we were doing. I just said, yeah, go play, explore, do side quests, whatever, and I'll just record it and go from there. And it actually worked pretty well. She did just play, and what I found was that the average time between moments of interest for her was very, very low. It was down at like 10 to 11 seconds when I went back through the footage after the fact. So that was interesting, that was cool, but it wasn't empirical, and we only had like 90 minutes to 2 hours playing this to go off of. And I mean, she was playing in front of a whole stream of like 500-600 people, so that might affect her cadence, the way she plays the game. So I wanted to go with yet something else that was a little more removed from emotion and individual behaviors. And so what I did is I went online and I found an interactive map through Map Genie, as you see here, that actually has collected screenshots of the entire game's map and stitched them together. Furthermore, they've marked each moment of interest or item that's worth collecting or encampment, treasure, lair, everything. They've marked it all on this map for us already, which saves us a ton of time. Because again, other than dynamic enemy encounters that just spawn and occur randomly or semi-randomly, I guess, this is what's going to determine how interesting the world is to explore, because these are the items that the developers have actually placed in their world for you to find and be captivated by. But what you'll notice pretty much immediately is that while there are a lot of items to find and there's a set distance between a lot of them that seem similar, you'll notice that there's a lot of clusters. And basically what I mean by this is that you'll see there's groupings of, say, 2 items that are meant to captivate your interest, or over here in the Quidditch pitch fields, we've got 2 items there, and then we have 2 right here really close, 2 right here really close, a whole cluster of buildings with a handful of things. And so it wouldn't really do it justice to gauge the distance and time between each of those moments of interest, because it would just throw off the average. It would just throw everything off because there's so many little moments where you walk outside the door of one thing that you discovered, and then you look to the left and there's the next thing, and the time between it was like half a second. So we don't really want to count that, otherwise it'll throw off the entire thing. So I knew that I needed to have a little bit more flexibility with this, and I pulled all of this stuff into Photoshop, first by taking screen caps of this page and then stitching it together and making my own composite of the map in a 15,000 by 15,000 pixel Photoshop project, which my computer didn't love. And that gets us something like this. We've got the whole map, and now we can actually interact with it, draw on it, do whatever else we need. First things first, I needed to go in and mark each individual cluster as best I could see them. And this was pretty tedious, but basically I went through the entire map and just marked what I gauged as clusters or individual items that were far enough apart from other items of interest that they would constitute their own cluster in and of themselves. As you can see, it was a little time consuming, and I will admit that this is very subjective. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Some of these things you might mark as individual instances, others you might say are clusters, and I didn't consider them clusters. This is subjective, but at the end of the day, this is just a stupid experiment for a YouTube video, so sue me. And you see we've got a ton of red X's all throughout the map of varying distances, areas that are very blank and open depending. It's just all over the place depending on where you are on the map, which is interesting. There's areas that are very, very empty that you're meant to just kind of fly your broom through and not spend too much time in. And then there's other areas that are just super dense where seemingly they would anticipate you spending a majority of your time in. And personally, I'll speak to this anecdotally. I have spent a ton of time in these areas of the map, so Yeah, no, the content in these areas definitely pulls you over there. And once again, this does not take into consideration dynamic enemy placement or maybe side quests or main quests that take you into areas of this map that don't have markers or items there. So it doesn't take that into consideration, but we're mainly interested in just broad exploration when you're just getting lost in the game. So it shouldn't really matter. What I did then is I needed to gauge the distance between these items, specifically in terms of gameplay time. If you're riding on your broom, which most players are going to be doing in order to explore this world after 5 hours or so, how much time does it take you to get from one cluster to the next cluster? How much time does it take you between those moments of interest? And once again, and perhaps most importantly, is it consistent through the game, or at least in specific areas of the game? And to do this, it was pretty straightforward. I basically went to a set fast travel point. I timed how long it would take me to travel between 2 points that I was able to measure very precisely and clearly in terms of time and distance. And then I was able to take those and copy those and extrapolate them to 2 or 3 or 4 times the size in order to get a legend basically of all the different times it would take you to navigate the world. Now I had basically a ruler to measure with, and I could go through the entire game's map and gauge based on the radius of these circles how much time and distance was between each moment of interest. And this took a while, but I was able to end up with a pretty comprehensive collection of times that also have a very strong visual element to it as well. This is basically what we end up with the blue circles representing 5 seconds of distance from the center to the outside of the circle. In other words, the radius represents about 5 seconds of travel. The red is twice the size and represents 10 seconds from the center outside. Again, the radius represents 10 seconds, and the green is 15 seconds. What I found was that Hogwarts Legacy overwhelmingly leans into 5 seconds between moments of interest and items. This world is extremely densely packed. It's kind of ridiculous. But what I actually found really interesting was not that a lot of this world is packed with 5 seconds between each moment of interest or thing that developers have put in here to captivate your time. Rather, it's that they very strategically placed these things, and in certain areas, they spread items out, and in other areas, they pack them in. Such as this moment right here. You see, this is all really dense as you're exploring north of Hogsmeade and everything. You would expect it. Yeah, this is like business for players. Like, you're coming out here to get stuff done, so it makes sense. But as you travel a little further south, you notice these fields just to the northeast of Hogwarts, which are very open and where you get some of the best views of Hogwarts. There's very little here. Most items are 15 seconds away from the next closest item of interest or moment of interest. There's not much here, and I think this was very intentional because in these areas, as you can see, there's really not much over here. It's just a big open area, but this is where you get the best view of Hogwarts. So they didn't want you to be distracted by all sorts of, treasure scattered around here and different things to pull your attention away. They want you to take in the sights, to just take a moment and look at this thing that they created that you get to explore. And then once you're done with that, you can move on past down here. You see the cave is an item of interest. Oh, that's interesting. We see the train tracks off in the distance. There's normally balloons here if you haven't popped the balloons yet. So you pop the balloons, and you see down here, there's some animals you can collect with the den over here. There's all sorts of stuff to discover. But when the game developers want you to take a moment and just take in the world and the view, they remove items to distract you. It's very, very interesting how they've done it. And again, it's very intentional. And as we go through the game map, you can see that there are areas that are very open and then areas that are very dense. And there's not a whole lot of room in between. There's these areas right here, which have a lot of the 10-second increments, which it kind of to me represents a transition phase from open area to close and dense area, which jives with what we see here. I mean, you can see items over here on the right, represented by the green, are very spread out, taking 15 seconds, 20 seconds between moments of interest. But as you move further to the west, you get to a very dense area, especially down here in the southwest. And as we move into some of the later game areas, it starts to get very, very dense, not a lot of time between moments of interest at all, and then it spreads out even more towards the end. Maybe this represents that they were running out of content. Maybe this means that they just don't expect players to spend a ton of time over here, or perhaps more likely to me, by the time players are exploring down here, they probably already have the broom upgrades that make traversing these areas faster. So this 10-second time increment drops a little bit lower because you can just travel faster with your various mounts and the upgraded broom. So that to me would make more sense than that they just ran out of content and gave up on sprinkling stuff in here. I think it's simply that they expect players to be able to move faster, so they spread things out a little bit. But what I found in doing these experiments is that sometimes the visual is more useful than the numbers. I can tell you the average is just about 12 seconds for most of the map, with certain areas like here bringing the average up closer to 20 seconds or 30 seconds in some areas like right here. But I think the visual does a pretty good job of telling you just how densely these things are packed. The blue are right on top of each other, where you can literally see in the distance the next item of interest the moment you finish the previous one, and it takes you 5 seconds to get to it. Whereas in the other areas where there's a lot of red or green, you might have to look and spend a little more effort and time finding the next moment of interest. But above and beyond all of this, there's not a lot of variability here. I mean, it's all pretty consistent between 5 and 10 seconds for the overwhelming majority of this map, with a few major areas that are very open, usually in spots where there's something very visually interesting to captivate you and to give you a chance to take that in. This is certainly very different from a game like Red Dead Redemption 2. When I did this test with Red Dead, the average time between moments of interest in the mid to late game was around 80 seconds, not 12 to 20 or anything like that, 80 seconds. And that's because they really took their time spreading out this massive world, and they wanted you to be alone with your thoughts, and they also were going for something a little bit more realistic. And The Witcher 3 was a little bit more tame than that, averaging between 30 and 40 seconds, but it was very, very consistent and also wanted you to really take your time and just take in the sights. But when we look at Hogwarts Legacy, I mean, you can see that things are very densely packed all the way through the map. And that's no mistake. I mean, they wanted this thing to be packed densely and for you to go and always have something that's going to pull your attention. It's certainly very repetitive. There's a lot of things in here that start to get a little old as time goes by. The Merlin, Mervyn, Morden puzzles are certainly one of them. Once you've seen 10, you've probably seen pretty much everything they have to offer. But it's a dense world, and it's consistently and competently done, which is what's more interesting to me. They really took a lesson from the devs of The Witcher 3, from Breath of the Wild devs, and they applied it very, very well here. And I gotta hand it to them, because it's not something that is easy at all. I mean, we've seen games like Gotham Knights that try to have interesting open worlds, or Assassin's Creed Valhalla, or should we say
Assassin's Creed Valhalla,
which was its own form of special. We can take all of these in and we can say, like, yeah, they I'm sure are very talented and gifted devs, but it's not that easy to make a compelling and interesting open world. It's just not that easy. And the fact that they came out swinging with very little experience and they did this good of a job, it's not perfect, but it's very, very impressively well done. That deserves a lot of praise. So really, Avalanche, Portkey Games, you guys deserve all the credit you're getting, because this is pretty impressive. Now, what you're going to do with this information now that you've watched this video, I do not know. It's probably going to be pretty useless info for you, but you know what? Hopefully you found it moderately interesting. And as you play through the rest of Hogwarts Legacy and other open world games, you learn to appreciate them ever so slightly more, because the art form involved with putting these things together is pretty crazy. And when it's done well, you probably don't even think about it or realize it. You just kind of enjoy the game and get lost within it. But now, hopefully, you'll understand why you get lost in it and why it seems so interesting and compelling to explore. So pretty cool, huh? Like, I think it's pretty interesting. And I've done this experiment, as I mentioned, a handful of times with a bunch of other games, and it always holds true. Each game has a slightly different time that they're targeting, and those times usually reflect the type of player they're going for. It can reflect the thematic decisions surrounding the game, like Red Dead having a longer time period makes sense. It's more realistic. Whereas if you're a game like Hogwarts Legacy, you're also targeting targeting a younger demographic, so a shorter period of time also makes sense for the shorter attention spans. So there's a bunch of little pieces that go into it, but it's super cool to see just how consistent the world design is. But one thing that isn't super consistent is the fun you'll be having within combat. I had a roller coaster ride with this game when it came to the combat. I started having a blast, and then I started to get a little bored, and then I started having an even bigger blast once I started messing around with the dark arts stuff and chaining attacks together, and then, you know, getting to the point where I can do one Avada Kedavra and kill everybody on the map at the same time. It was super, super cool. And then I started having just a terrible time because the game was super, super boring and bloated, even when I didn't use those dark arts spells. There's a lot here, and there's a lot of statistical reasons why the combat kind of falls apart towards the end, and we're going to talk about all of it here in the next segment. As for a rough rundown on the minutia of the combat, as was seen in all of the early access events, previews, and trailers, there's a handful of spells that you can use. There's parries, ancient magic, combos, dodging, fast and long dodging, iframes, there's shields that the player can use, there's juggling of enemies, and there's different color-coded spells and charms that can be used to break the shields of other enemies based on, again, what color spell the player character has that corresponds with the enemy shield. Furthermore, in terms of enemy variety, there are humans, trolls, all sorts of beasts, and infamous foes, which are largely just more powerful versions of other humanoid wizards. And in general, all of these are really, really fun. However, there are occasional times where these guys break, where the AI just snaps, or they do something really, really stupid. I'm sure this is fixed by the time you're watching this, at least I really, really hope. But at least in the first few weeks after launch, there were multiple occasions where enemies just wouldn't aggro. They wouldn't enter combat, and so you could just attack them forever and it wouldn't, like, they wouldn't do anything. It was really, really strange. Look at this clip right here. This executioner enemy doesn't enter combat, so he just takes shots perpetually, and no matter what you do, he doesn't fight back. It's really, really, really strange. And while it's nice to occasionally get a break from the difficult combat, moments like this are just kind of annoying, and they definitely tear you out of any sense of immersion you would have had, which is one of the things that Hogwarts Legacy does really well, especially with the music, the ambiance, the art style. Everything just ties together so well and can really make you feel like you're a part of this world. And then moments like this come along that just rip you straight out, and it's kind of a bummer. But again, hopefully they've patched this out by the time you're watching this video or by the time you play it. Now, in order to use all of the spells within combat, you're going to eventually unlock various spell wheels if you choose to go that route within the skill tree. These spell wheels can be quickly swapped between and allow you to basically create a spell loadout. As you get later in the game, you'll certainly have your arrangement of spells that you like to rely on. And especially while playing on hard, you're probably going to get to the point where you have a routine where you start combat on one of these wheels, go through all of the spells, cycle to the next wheel, cycle through all of those, go to the next wheel, cycle through all of those, and etc., until all of them have recharged and you just continue going around the wheel. Some people have expressed frustration with this because it seems overly simple. Like, you just get into this routine where you just cycle through all the spells as you go around, and it's just kind of like boop, 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 and you work all the way around until you've used all of them, and then you just repeat the process. But honestly, I'm okay with that. It's sort of like min-maxing a character in an action RPG, for me at least, where it requires effort to build that wheel in that way, where it actually feels as though you're breaking the game. It takes effort to do that. You have to work very intentionally and work on the timing, swap the spells out. It's not something that just happens. Sure, if there was a way to like automatically assign spells where it sets it up in that way, or cycle spells where it automatically executes them in time as they become available, yeah, that would be probably too automated and would be quite stupid. But in this case, I don't find it to be that way at all, especially because multiple enemies will come in wearing those shields that have different weaknesses. So even if you have the spell wheel built in a certain way with spells you really, really like to focus on, it might be the case that, oh, they have a yellow shield. Oop, I've got to swap to this wheel now, out of order, use that yellow spell, and now I can swap back and continue my routine. And because that's constantly happening, it forces you to think on your feet, and it adds some dynamism, which I really like. Also, later in the game, a bunch of enemies will start to have their shields pop up briefly and then disappear after you initially saw it, which allows the player once more another level of challenge where they have to be, okay, that person's purple. Okay, now the purple's gone. I have to remember they were purple as I swap and then deal a purple spell towards them so that they break and I can deal actual damage. I think a hardcore mode would be awesome where they come in and maybe it's just a quick little plume of smoke or something indicating the purple shield, and then it disappears instantly and you won't see it until you actually break the shield again. I think that would work really well, and again, add another level of challenge for players like me who started to get bored towards the end of the game. But speaking of making the game too easy by the end, let's talk about potions real quick. So within the potions, there's the Edurus potion, which offers a rocky skin defense boost. There's the Maxima potion, which offers a spell damage boost. Focus reduces cooldowns for your spells. Thunder Brew allows a passive AoE damage effect, and you have an invisibility potion if you want to stealth through certain sections. Paired with these will often be plants, such as the Chinese chomping cabbage, the venomous tentacula, and the mandrakes. Now, when using all of these, it's very easy to break the combat entirely, which is a real frustration for me because these things take a good amount of effort to not just like brew, but also in the case of the plants, you have to actually farm these things. You have to go and build the right sized planter for them in the room of requirement after purchasing the blueprint for a good chunk of change. And then you have to wait actual in-game time to grow them up properly. And these things can only be used once and then they're gone. So they're pretty expensive in terms of time of the player required to actually acquire and use them. And so I was thinking that these things would be like the necessary element to make a playthrough on very hard actually viable. But no, like the game is pretty playable, pretty easy, even still on hard. And then when you toss in like the cabbage and a tentacula, and then you stun them with a mandrake, all while, popping your Thunder Brew potion, you use Maxima and Focus and Edurus and everything. You're not taking any damage because of Edurus, and the Maxima and the Focus potions make it so your cooldowns are super, super quick. And you also deal massive damage all over the place. It just totally breaks the combat and makes big boss fights a joke. And it's kind of frustrating because I'm like, I'm working extra hard for this stuff. I'm showing I'm putting in extra effort in the game, and on hard, like, it's not even really viable because it makes the combat too easy. So in a way, it almost feels like the player is punished for using these things because it just breaks the combat system. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's good because it's like, yeah, you spent the time to make these things. They're really useful and they break the combat system. But for me, it was just kind of frustrating because I did all of this stuff and then I go on to these boss fights, and as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to do one of these things, you should use all of them. If you're going to pop a potion and use a plant, use them all, because why not? You probably farmed all of them. You probably brewed all the potions. Just pop them all off and go crazy. Try to min-max the boss fight and go have fun with it. And the boss will die within 20 seconds. And you're like, okay, well, that was uneventful. And then you're kind of frustrated because you did all this effort and then that was just a total joke. I will admit, this is like sort of a contradiction in my view, because I do like games that allow you to just break the combat, where you go in like and you just min-max it and all of a sudden you have a build that's just crazy good. And I find that really, really satisfying because you've clearly overcome this challenge in the game, and that can be really, really fun. However, I think the difference between having a build that's like stupid OP in Elden Ring or in Monster Hunter World, and the difference between that and having an overpowered build in Hogwarts Legacy is that in Hogwarts Legacy, the game's already kind of broken before you go and build your character out with a really good spell selection, with the potions and with the plants. So adding those things just breaks it doubly and removes any sort of challenge or fun. Whereas in like Elden Ring or Monster Hunter, you can play the game and beat the monsters or the boss fights straight without any sort of exploits or careful crafting of your character. But if you put in that extra effort to min-max your character, you can beat the boss much more easily, and in some cases make sort of a show of it at the same time. I would still say in Monster Hunter and in Elden Ring and FromSoft games, you're not actually just like raffle stomping on the boss. There still is a little bit of challenge, and you can't sleep on them because they can still kill you very, very quickly. But at the very least, it's way easier in comparison. Whereas in this game, again, it doesn't feel like you even need the potions or the plants to have an easy time with the combat. So tossing them in just totally breaks it even more. And you're like, okay, well, I was hoping that would like add something fun, but instead it just made me feel like I was stomping on a bunch of ants instead of having a boss fight, But don't worry, we're going to talk a lot more about the difficulty options in just a minute. Now, aside from the minutia of combat and all of the plants, spells, and potions that you can use, there's also what are known as talents. There are a bunch of different talents, all divided into 5 basic categories: spells, dark arts, Arts, Core, Stealth, and the Room of Requirement. This is basically this game's version of a skill tree where you can focus your talent points wherever you want to focus your gameplay. My wife, for example, didn't touch the Dark Arts talents at all because she was trying to play as a really good person. Whereas I basically maxed out the Dark Arts skill set and didn't focus at all on any of the stealth abilities or very many of the core abilities. I do like this because it can add some dynamism between playthroughs. Some people are going to be using, for example, the long dodge, which allows you to basically warp across the map with iframes, whereas other players might go the entire game and never use that ability because they were focused elsewhere. I think this is really, really cool. And while towards the end of the game, most players will end up just having all of the same abilities across the board, I do think that this is a cool inclusion, especially for the first half of the game or so, while it's still different from player to player. In a sequel, I think there's a lot of potential for them to expand these things out. For example, Stealth only has 4 talents within it, and 2 of these are basically the same exact ability with different potency. Sense of Secrecy level 1 reduces the enemy's ability to detect you, and the second level of it also further reduces their ability to detect you in stealth sequences. Beyond that, there's the Human Demiguise ability, which allows you to sprint while using the Disillusionment charm. And then once you reach level 22, you can unlock Petrificus Totalis Mastery, which creates an AoE around somebody recently affected by Petrificus Totalis, allowing you to basically stealth take down multiple enemies at one time. But that's it. There's only 4 abilities within stealth, which really shows you how low of a priority it was. So in a future game, I would love it if they expanded this out and allowed you to really focus your playstyle wherever you wanted. If you wanted to be a stealth-focused wizard, why not make that super viable? Make it difficult. Sure, you don't have to cater every single level to them, but at the very least allow it to be a playstyle or at least a specialization more than just 4 abilities. Personally, I suspect that they probably had a lot more stealth abilities that were cut because only 4 talents is so low a number compared to like the 16 core abilities that makes me wonder if they had more and they just cut them, because 4 is just, it's so low. I mean, maybe they originally intended like 10 and then they just had to cut some because it wasn't super viable or they didn't feel like they could get them working. But either way, it's really, really weird that there's only 4. But you know what? Now we need to talk about the gear and equipment system because it's, I mean, man, it's rough. To break it down to its bare bones level, open world exploration is usually built around a key incentive. For a lot of games, this might be the discovery of crafting materials, gear, in-game currency, cosmetics, or XP that can be used to level up. A lot of games also provide a combination of these things to make sure that you are rewarded for taking time out of your run to complete side content. The problem I have with Hogwarts Legacy's approach to this is that they are not balanced properly, and at least 2 of these rewards are laughably bad. Firstly, the cosmetics. These are tied into the gear you will discover, which is also given levels and, in more advanced cases, perks that make the armor pieces more useful depending on your playstyle. But to focus on the cosmetic aspect for a moment, I don't think I'm the only one that feels as though almost all of these are ugly as hell. This is of course subjective, I'll grant you that happily, but I was really, really frustrated when I would regularly discover a new piece of interesting gear that gave my character more health, defense stats, or some other perk, only to realize that this piece of clothing looked like it was pulled out of some bizarre Tumblr post about a fan fiction of Harry Potter crossed with a toddler tripping on LSD's crayon drawings of the Wiggles in the Wizarding world. And before you say it in the comments below, I know that there's a transmogrification system. It's the only reason that this doesn't deduct a full point from the game's review score as far as I'm concerned. You can in fact go to any piece of equipment and change the look of it if you want to any other piece of equipment that you either currently hold in your possession or that you have previously discovered or gotten through some sort of DLC or other means of discovery. And I think this is a great inclusion, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't excuse how laughably bad these designs more generally are. When you explore and discover a new piece of equipment, if it looks cool, it feels all the more rewarding because you feel like you've earned something unique. Because you have. You will don that piece of gear and navigate the world more proudly showing it off. A great example of when this works would be in a game like The Witcher 3 when you get a unique sword or armor set. I can't even tell you how many times and how often I get comments on my past videos discussing The Witcher 3 or in videos like this where I show snippets of gameplay and I show off the cool armor set and swords that I have for Geralt on my original save file of the game. It's like a badge of honor, one that you only get if you've done the work to earn that piece of gear that looks really cool. But that sense of accomplishment is completely missing in Hogwarts Legacy. I seriously can't think of a single item in the game that I thought of as cool enough to justify wearing without transmogrification. Throughout the entire game, almost without exception, I would change the appearance of everything back into one unified outfit that I had already unlocked, because at least I knew that wouldn't look ridiculous. Which, I want to be clear, while a great inclusion, is in and of itself an annoying and tedious task. The fact that you can't find anything cool to wear while out in the world is bad enough. But then, to add insult to injury, you have to spend a minute or two in the menus of the game manually changing the appearance of all of the things you just equipped so that you don't look like a Bozo the Clown impersonator while exploring the wizarding world. In my opinion, fixing a problem with tedium is barely a fix. It may make it better, but the problem shouldn't exist in the first place. There's so much potential in this universe for full-out cosmetics and outfits. It's just so disappointing to see the developers blow their opportunity in this department so bad. And they do it to the point where many of the cosmetics look as though they're actually from some sort of bizarre Sims 4 DLC that nobody's ever heard of. But that's not actually where the problems with the gear end. Gear itself in the game is directly tied to your leveling and strength. There are a lot of other open world RPGs that use gear as the primary mode of leveling and strength. Chief among them would once again be examples like The Witcher 3 or Monster Hunter World and many, many other games as well. But the reason it's important to note this is that it's because there are plenty of examples of when this goes well and how to do this properly, which is why it's all the more baffling to see how poorly this style of leveling is implemented here. In just a moment, we're going to go through more of those spreadsheet stats to explain how exactly the combat just totally breaks towards the end of the game, but I do want to say that the gear is one of the reasons that it breaks. And I also want to mention once again that those Merlin puzzles with the limited inventory affect this as well. Because you constantly are running out of inventory space, you will constantly be cycling through equipment that you discover while out in the world, meaning that none of it ever really stays with you and is significant enough to really appreciate. Once you find a new robe that's really, really useful, chances are within about 45 minutes of gameplay, you'll find another one to replace it. And this isn't inherently a bad thing. There's a lot of other games, action RPGs, for example, that constantly are throwing new gear at you with incremental improvements as you go along. But the difference is they don't make it so painfully difficult to equip, unequip, to sell, to hold it in your inventory like Hogwarts Legacy does. I recently played Diablo 4, and in Diablo 4, if you want to swap out equipment, you just right-click on the equipment that you want to equip. You equip it, the old stuff gets moved into your inventory, which is pretty expansive, and you can hold on to it till you sell it or do whatever else you want to do with it. In Hogwarts Legacy, if you want to do that same thing, you're going to equip the new thing, and then that old piece of clothing that has interesting stat benefits is now basically useless to you. So you can either deconstruct it to just free up the inventory space if you don't want to go back to Hogsmeade for 60 coins, or you can hold on to it and then work your way back and try to sell it off for some quick change, either at one of the world shops that are out and about in the world as you explore, or again, all the way back at Hogsmeade if you choose to go that route. But that's not where the tedium ends. There's another system called traits. When I did a poll of about 500 of you guys while we were streaming one day, I found out very quickly that most people who have played this game haven't used the traits beyond the initial tutorial. I mean, right now, you may have played Hogwarts Legacy and you're hearing me say traits, and you might be like, what? What are those? Traits are upgrades to individual pieces of clothing that require animal resources to attach. These are the animal resources you'll collect from the various animals that you've collected. You feed them and then pet them or brush them, and in exchange you get one or a few of those pieces. These offer all sorts of combat boosts and can be really, really useful, at least on paper. But again, you remember what I said with the combat feeling too easy to begin with before you add in potions and plants and everything? Well, imagine also adding in traits, which can allow you to upgrade the damage output of your spells by 5%, or of this particular spell's cooldown, you can decrease it by a set amount, or any number of other upgrades which these traits offer. It's a great addition here, but the game isn't difficult enough and doesn't have a difficulty option high enough to warrant their inclusion, because if you choose to engage with these things, it will just break the game even further, to the point where it's so painfully easy that there's zero challenge left at all. And every time I bring up difficulty in one of these games, I get people in the comment section that say, okay, well then just don't use the potions, don't use the plants, don't use these things that make the game too easy. If I say, hey, Avada Kedavra totally makes the game too easy, it's kind of a bummer, people are going to say, okay, well don't use that. Easy, you fix the problem. If you don't like the Sword of Night and Flame in Elden Ring as it was on launch, which was totally broken, just don't use that sword because it'll spoil the fun for you, because it'll make everything too easy. But with Hogwarts Legacy, it very quickly starts to feel like you just have to not engage with most of its additional content in order to not break the combat. which is weird. I mean, it's almost at the point where it's like you're playing the game and you're like, oh, hey, after level 24, the game gets too easy. And people say, okay, well then just stop leveling up. It's like, no, like I'm playing the game. I shouldn't have to stop playing the game to have fun. Like, that's on the developers to balance this more properly. And that brings me into the discussion of these stats that totally explain why the game feels the way it does. The first thing I want to point out are the list of spells with their various damage, distance ranges, cooldown durations, all of that stuff. One of the more interesting things is that Avada Kedavra actually deals specifically 10 million damage. So in theory, if you were playing the game and there was an enemy with 10,000,001 damage points, it wouldn't kill him. Avada Kedavra would not kill them, which I just find funny. You know, they had to come up with what number they were going to put for the damage. And so they're like, I don't know, 10 million. Like, we're not going to have enemies that high. And they're like, okay, that sounds good. Sounds good. One of the other pretty cool things you can find in this spreadsheet of all the data mine stats is how the player and NPCs scale, which is going to tell us why the game starts to feel broken as we get higher and higher level. As you can see here, the scaling is exponential, meaning that every time you level up, you're going to see an exponential increase in the effect of that level up. In other words, going from level 30 to 31 will increase your health total by much more than going from level, say, 10 to 11. And you can see this right here. Going from level 10 to 11, we get a 30-point increase in player health. But going from level 30 to 31, we see a 145-point differential. I mean, it starts to really get crazy, especially towards the end. Right here, a 290-point spread. It's wild. But you know what? This wouldn't be a problem if enemies were scaling exponentially in the same way so that you're always on the same level as the enemies are. But it's not actually like that. As you can see over here, the health to damage values for enemies is very strange. It's not a straight exponential graph. It's actually kind of staggered because they've manually gone in and altered some of these values. And when we look at each individual enemy's different stats, you can start to see why this gets a little more complicated than just make them scale with the player, because there's many different variations. Some of these max level at different points. Like here, you can see Ranrak doesn't actually scale above 35. The boss variation doesn't scale above 35, but the dragon variation does scale to level 40 as a max level if the player happens to be that high level. So that's kind of strange. You can see they have different metas for each individual year of student. So you can have 7th year students that have higher health than everybody else, and they can also scale all the way up to 40. The various different trolls have all different level scaling. So the trolls in the forest can't go above level 33, whereas the death troll variant has 5,000 HP, can go all the way to 40. So all of this stuff is tweaked in a very strange way. It's also, I'm sorry, it's really funny to me that the training dummies have a max leveling of 75. Like, I don't know why, I just find that funny. It's like they're just training dummies, but they're technically able to scale way higher than any other enemy. I get it because they're training dummies, but still, it's stupid. It's funny. Year 5 professors also can scale all the way up to 75. I'm not sure exactly why you'd be doing this, because of course you can't really engage in combat within the halls of Hogwarts, but you know what? It's still, I guess, cool that it's there. And the last thing that really complicates this calculation is that they have different damage taken multipliers and vulnerability multipliers depending on which difficulty you're on. How this works is basically the damage taken multiplier is for regular attacks or spells, nothing too special, but when they enter a vulnerable state, when they're stunned or something else, then they will take this multiplier of damage instead of this. So they don't add this one. The vulnerability multiplier will replace the damage taken multiplier in that stunned state. And as you can see, for each enemy archetype, there are different scales for each of these. Spider shooters will not be more difficult or easier on any difficulty level. Animagus, or the Dugbogs, or the Extortionists, the Pensive Protectors, the Spider Matriarchs, all of these will be the exact same for every player playing on story, easy, or medium. The only time they'll change is when you go on hard, where they'll take 50% of the damage that they would have taken on normal. And this is true of most of them, with the hardest enemies seeing a boost in damage taken for the easier difficulties, whereas on hard, all of this stuff stays the same, and on medium, it stays the same as well. This makes sense to me because these encounters are particularly time intensive. They can take a little bit longer. The health pools are much larger. So if somebody's playing on the story difficulty, it's probably because they just either don't have time to engage with those big boss fights, they don't want to spend the time doing it, or they just don't have the patience or the focus or something. They just can't manage it. Like if I gave the controller to my little brother, he probably wouldn't be able to sit through a 10-minute boss fight, because that's just, it's a big endurance fight for the player where you really have to be on edge the whole time. So shortening those fights by increasing the damage taken makes sense to me. But you'll notice this is a very different scaling compared to the scaling for damage output. In comparison, the damage output scaling is very, very different. While the defense multipliers are largely linear, where you can see here, it's going to be 50% of the damage taken on hard, no matter what. It doesn't matter what spells you're using, what level you are, they will take half of whatever damage you're spitting out, depending on which difficulty you're on. But the damage they deal doesn't actually change as you level up or as you change the difficulty, which is why even playing on hard doesn't actually make the game feel that much harder. They did data mine a damage mod level, which was interesting, and this thing basically, I think, would be used for modifying, again, the damage of the enemy, but none of the enemies listed in the data mined collection, which includes bosses and all sorts of different enemy types, none of them vary from this low ranking, which makes me wonder if this was a stat they originally intended to use and then decided to just leave as basically a flat level, not affecting it, or if maybe I'm just totally misunderstanding this. I haven't been able to come up with an explanation, but it is really strange that they have a whole segment on this data table for damage mod level, and it's just, it doesn't change for any boss or any enemy, whether they're basic or difficult. And lastly, when we look at the damage multiplier versus power level, which is the level of all of your equipment, basically, when it all kind of comes together, you can see what your power level is. You can see that the damage multiplier quickly spikes up once you reach about level 400 in terms of power level. Before that, it's much more linear up until 200. In other words, it increases at a steady rate, but then it begins to exponentially increase after that, which is why it can start to feel so stupid easy as you get further in the game, because technically the more powerful you become and the higher level your gear becomes, the more crazy damage you'll output, but the enemies don't scale to that whatsoever. The enemy's damage reduction scaling is already established. The enemy's health bar scaling is already established based on level, so none of this will actually affect it. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a game designer or anything, but to me it seems pretty straightforward that all of these graphs, if you wanted players to feel a consistent challenge, should be pretty much one-to-one. You should be able to overlap all of them and it should feel the same, if not increasing the challenge later in the game to keep it interesting, making it so enemies' damage values and health values begin to outpace the player as you get higher in level, increasing the challenge. Because after all, players are going to play the game more and more and more, get more experienced in the game, and thus they will start to have those sort of built-in advantage compared to players who are just starting, because they'll know how all of this stuff works. And if you were to do that and make the game more difficult towards the end, where players are all but forced to use every single tool at their disposal with the plants, with the potions, with everything, I think you could end up with a game that is challenging and stays engaging all the way to the end. Whereas right now, it feels like you play the first 15 hours and then everything after that just begins to be a walk in the park. And I honestly feel kind of bad because a lot of these talents are actually kind of cool and would be awesome to use. But like this one, the Endurance Potion makes you take an additional 50% less damage, totaling 100% reduced damage, so you just won't take damage, and deflects projectile attacks back to enemies. So 0 damage, and it deflects projectile attacks back to enemies where they'll take the damage instead. This thing's awesome, but if the combat system is already basically too easy with the regular potion, what do you think adding this talent in is going to do to it? It's going to just break it even further. And other things, like the Wiggenweld potion heals an additional 2300 HP. Already, it felt like I had too many Wiggenweld potions. I had 25 in my inventory basically at all times, and I rarely dipped below 20. Or Enduring Curse, a cursed effect remains on an enemy for twice as long, 20 to 40 seconds. Defeating a cursed enemy restores 15% of your max health. Like, these talents are badass and really, really could help in the case of like an end game where there's really difficult enemies that you need every little bitty thing to get an advantage on. This could be that. I think they have the foundation for all of those necessary improvements to the player's build out here. But there is no challenge in the combat, especially in the late game. And as a result, it just starts to feel pointless to continue playing. It really makes me wonder if they have plans for like maybe a boss rush mode or maybe a new game plus or something like that that could actually add that challenge back in. Because as of right now, as far as I can tell, there's just no reason to engage with this stuff. Whereas if they introduced, again, a new game plus mode where I could bring all of my stuff, all my skills and everything to a new game and get that challenge again, I could spend the second run through learning all of these talents, applying these and building a character that's really, really max leveled. I think that could be awesome. But all told, it's just kind of a bummer to see all of this cool stuff that I think would be pretty interesting to engage with and to be at the point where I'm like, I don't know if it's even worth focusing on it because I'm already not really having fun since the combat's so easy. You know, it's a big bummer because this is cool. I just wish I had a reason to use it, right? And you know what? Maybe there were other things that were cut. Maybe they intended to have more boss variety. Maybe they had more dungeons planned with more variable bosses. I don't know. Right now, with most of the bosses being comprised of pensive bosses, trolls, infamous foes, dark wizards, all of that, it's fine, but it definitely feels as though there's not a lot of enemy variety here. A sequel could definitely take this up a notch, add all sorts of different magical beasts and things that could be super fun to fight. We're just gonna have to wait and see. We do know that they're working on a sequel almost certainly, so it's just gonna be a matter of time. Yeah, it's a little bit of a bummer that you spend the whole game maximizing your build, getting all this super cool stuff established, and then you reach the end, and right after the story ends, it's like all the challenge just evaporates and you're just like, okay, well, I guess I'll go kill a troll in 15 seconds again because I can do that. So fun. And some last little tidbits I'll mention in this section before we start getting into like discussing the narrative and the story a little bit. I did do a good amount of experimenting with different difficulty options, as you can see in this clip. Basically, I went in and fought the same troll multiple times, once on hard and then on the story difficulty and all of them in between. All of the gear, traits, and everything else was kept the same. The only thing that changed was the difficulty between the fight. I saved right before it, and after I would complete the fight, I would quick load back to the save file and then try it again after changing the difficulty. I actually did this experiment before we heard about all these data mine stats, and what I have in my notes is pretty much exactly what we saw in the stats from the data mine. Because I was fighting a troll, I basically saw exactly this, that the troll seemed to take a ton of extra damage compared to playing on hard. On hard, it took me a lot longer to take down the troll, but I didn't feel as though the troll was dealing inordinately more damage to me at all. It felt as though the troll was basically the same. I basically just was shooting Nerf bullets instead of real bullets. There might be a damage multiplier deep in the game for bosses or enemies on higher difficulties where they deal more damage on higher difficulties than otherwise, but I didn't really feel that. I didn't detect it, and none of the data mine stats really demonstrate that, at least as of right now when I'm recording the video. So who knows? Maybe like tomorrow after I film this, somebody's going to data mine more stats, add them to this sheet, and then it's going to be like, oh yeah, no, there is a multiplier that takes place. But what I do know is that all that really matters at the end of the day is how the player feels, because there could be a 0.01 modifier, but it doesn't really matter because it's not enough. I think that the enemies should deal more damage to you, making combat more difficult, instead of just making it so individual boss fights take a little bit longer on harder difficulties. To me, that's not as interesting as if the boss is actually more dangerous. It's just making it so it takes me a little longer to complete the inevitable. And also, I will note that as far as I can tell, there's also no change in the artificial intelligence between difficulty modes. I did experiment with some stealth sequences with different difficulty options, and maybe I just am bad at this, but I didn't see or notice any significant change in detection sensitivity between difficulty levels. And I also have not found any data mine stats to reflect that. So as far as I'm aware, difficulty doesn't affect that whatsoever. The AI will stay the same regardless. And I think that's fine. I'm not asking for it to be like, oh, The Last of Us Part 2. They start talking to each other and having whole conversations while on patrol together. I'm not asking for something like that. I just am reporting that there is no change in AI. And it once again reaffirms the idea that stealth was a real afterthought here. They have some stealth elements, but I think a lot of it was probably cut closer to launch, or perhaps early on in development, but it just seems as though there was more there that they eventually cut. But enough complaining about combat gear and difficulty. Lol, Luke's such a tryhard. I know, it's cringe. Let's just talk about the story a little bit and delve into this and then wrap this whole thing up. First things first, this may just be me, but the male voice actor sounds remarkably like Daniel Radcliffe. He has the same gravelly, strained voice, and at many times is so similar that it really makes me wonder if this was intentional.
I don't understand why she seems to have gone to such great lengths to tell her story without their knowledge.
Stunning is one of the most useful spells in your arsenal. It's sort of a wizard's bread and butter, really. So, come on then, Nigel.
It's a pretty unique voice and sound to have in your throat, so I would be surprised if this was coincidental. Let me know in the comment section if you think that they intentionally made them sound similar or if I'm just being weird. As for other tidbits for the main story, we've touched on a lot of them. I feel like Ranrock and Rookwood are totally underutilized and are honestly kind of lackluster main enemies. Exposures to the professors are interesting, but we never really get to know them. And overall, the story just feels very, very lightweight. It's just here to justify you exploring the world, which is why after about 5-10 hours, they kind of abandon it and then occasionally come back and are like, oh, by the way, this is happening in Hogwarts. And you're like, oh yeah, I'm a student there. I remember. I initially thought of this as like a really bad thing because I was like, oh, they had the Harry Potter franchise. They could have done so much narratively that would have been interesting. But honestly, I think it might have actually been a very intentional choice to have a very lightweight story here. And I think it's because, for one, you're just not going to replicate the magic of the Harry Potter franchise. You're just not. Like, I know we can say all the stuff we want about J.K. Rowling. We can say all of that stuff, but let's be perfectly honest with ourselves. The reason that Harry Potter was very successful is because as a story, it's captivating and it's relatable. It just is. You don't have to like J.K. Rowling for that to be true. It's just the reality of the matter. It's not like there was a big conspiracy to make her popular 25 years ago, okay? People just liked the story. Maybe she got lucky, maybe she's genius. I don't know, and I personally don't really care. The point is that Harry Potter as a story is very unique and is special, which is why it was so successful. And no matter how gifted the writers and designers and everything at Avalanche are and who work with Portkey Games, no matter how great they all are, which I'm sure they're all tremendous, they probably are not going to replicate that lightning in a bottle. So in a lot of ways, why try? If they spent a ton of time and effort writing this hugely expansive story and doing all this really, really nitty-gritty stuff in the world building, they probably would have put it out. Hardcore Harry Potter fans would have been like, there's some problems with it. I think it's fine. And the more casual gamers would be like, I don't know why they're trying so hard. Like, didn't need to. It's just a fun video game. Chill out a little bit. So I just don't think there's a lot of pro to the con of potentially making it seem really try hard or having a situation like Fantastic Beasts where it just starts to feel like a totally different franchise. And honestly, after a lot of consideration, I'm actually glad that they put more focus on the side content. There is a lot of repetitious stuff here, like the Merlin puzzles, as I mentioned ad nauseum up to this point. But there are also a good number of side quests that are pretty compelling. Some that stand out would be like Alexandra's troll. Basically, she's been trying to take care of a large troll that the villagers want killed. She thought she could basically domesticize this troll, and she was trying to give him a home and love on him, and it's just not working, and he's causing a lot of problems. So they hire you to go and take care of it. It's such a weird and unique quest that I actually really find almost like emotionally taxing to engage with. I know that might be weird, but it's because she's like trying to help this troll live a life, like this anthropomorphized life with the villagers and stuff. She wants to treat him like almost a kid, and yet it just doesn't work. And it's a story that sticks with you. And honestly, I'm sure that side quest is going to stick with me for a very, very long time. in a good way. Or there's the other quests, which you could just boil down into a fetch quest, for example, but they're always tied into a more emotional story. It's a family heirloom, and then you get the backstory of where the family came from, why they were here, and even though you're just diving into the lake to find a family heirloom, you're doing it because it has an emotional effect on a character in the world. There's never just, can you go get me 3 branches of broomwood and then I can craft a gibble goop? And it's never just that simple. There's always a story tied to it. These things are great, and I think that they really hit it out of the park when it comes to this side stuff, and it's why the side stuff I think is far more memorable than most of the main story. Ranrock and Rookwood, I think there was potential there, but they really feel like an afterthought, especially after the first few hours of the game. It's a little frustrating as somebody that was really looking forward to a main story tied up into Gringotts Bank and all the cool stuff they could have done with that, but you know what? Beggars can't be choosers, I suppose. One thing I am pretty confident about, though, are the consequences, or I guess lack thereof, in this game. And this was something, no matter how you split it, this was pretty disappointing. Now, in the main story and in all of the side quests that I've brought up, there are very few consequences that really have an impact on the world. I get it, this is a prequel to a very well-established franchise, so they can't come out swinging with major alterations to the game's lore, like having a floor of Hogwarts collapse or something as a result of your decisions. It just wouldn't make sense. But even simple stuff like choosing to help somebody or not help somebody, or choosing to help somebody for the simple sake of helping somebody, or to demand money from them in exchange for your efforts. All of these little things have basically zero impact on the broader story and the relationships you have with various characters. In fact, the whole story basically comes down to one decision you make at the last possible moment. Even the decision whether or not to learn the unforgivable curses and to use them doesn't come into effect in the main story. You can even use the unforgivable curses, like Avada Kedavra, right in front of professors at the end of the game, and they will do nothing, something I'll talk about in just a moment. And in fact, all of the choices you make throughout the entire game, again, boil down to basically a decision whether you want to harness the power of this room for yourself, or if you want to just seal it off and do the good thing with Professor Fig. And that's it. And it basically affects how you see him die, or whether you see him die at all, because if you choose the bad ending like I did, you just don't see him come back. He just disappears, and they're just like, yeah, he's dead 10 minutes later. It's really, really weird. And nobody around the castle responds to you or says anything differently to you based on what you choose. It's just done. It's a different cutscene, and that's it. It's really kind of frustrating, especially because we got a taste of what dynamic interactions with NPCs could be like. Early in the game, you'll notice as you walk around Hogwarts, if you're wearing some ridiculous thing like, say, pajamas or a suit of armor or something as you explore the hallways, students will notice and will comment on it. So I was looking forward to the end of the game, after choosing the bad thing, to hear students say, oh, that's the guy that caused Fig's death or something like that. But instead, nothing happens, nobody says anything, and again, towards the end of the game, all of that dynamism, all of the interesting things that could happen just melt away, and we end up with just a husk of the game because all of the innards have been eaten out already. That sounded like really sexual, eaten out. I was thinking like a corn cob, and then you ate out the inside of the corn cob so it leaves the husk. But I realize when I am talking about the inside of something and then I say eaten out, people think otherwise. Oops. But to discuss the unforgivable curses specifically, learning them is pretty straightforward. You'll be completing quests alongside Sebastian, a member of Slytherin, and as you progress through the quest lines, you will get the opportunity to learn some of these unforgivable curses. These are extremely powerful spells, especially once you've unlocked the talents that correspond to them, that fundamentally change the way that gameplay works. That is, if you choose to indulge yourself with them. How it normally works is that you will complete the quest, and then at the end, Sebastian will ask you whether or not you want to learn it. You can accept or decline based on how you were playing. My wife refused the opportunity to learn these as she was role-playing as a goody two-shoes student. Meanwhile, I jumped at every opportunity and learned every dark curse that I could because I was playing as a chaotic evil character. Normally, the dialogue choices are pretty clear, with Sebastian often directly asking whether or not you would like to learn this forbidden curse, but with Avada Kedavra, I noticed that the question was a little less pointed. At the end of the mission where he kills Solomon and pisses off his sister for very good reason, he will ask you whether or not he was justified in the action. And this will prompt the player with one of two options. You can either say that everybody everybody should know the unforgivable curse of Avada Kedavra, or nobody should. If you answer that nobody should know the curse, immediately you will lose the opportunity to learn the killing curse here. It's a really, really strange way of asking the question. I initially answered it this way, not because I thought that this was the cruelest answer, but rather because I thought it fit with my playstyle. In effect, I was saying that nobody should learn the killing curse. Meanwhile, I was going to learn it myself so that I could use it against all of the defenseless people who don't know it. However, I was soon baffled when the quest ended without giving me the opportunity to learn the curse at all. And the only reason I knew that I should have been able to learn how to use the curse was because the quest description within the menus described Avada Kedavra as one of the rewards for the quest. So I knew that I had messed up somehow. I played for another few hours and realized I had seemingly missed my chance. And in one last-ditch effort, I decided to go back to the Undercroft and speak with Sebastian and see if there was some way I could learn the curse anyways. And sure enough, you can. If you go back and request this secret information, he will give it to you without much protest, and this apparently works for all of the forbidden curses. If you decline them during the story missions, you can still get access to them later after the fact if you change your mind, meaning you could, in theory, play through the whole game, get through the main story, and then learn the unforgivable curses for the end game. Though I will admit I have not done this, I would just speculate that this is the case. You can decide whether or not Sebastian should be turned in to the ministry for committing the unforgivable crime of using Avada Kedavra against his uncle Solomon. But even if you choose to report him and turn him in, which is something that my wife decided to do for her Goody Two-Shoes playthrough, he just tells you that he's being investigated and that he probably will be going to Azkaban, but he's still hanging around at the end of the story, so you can still learn stuff. It's a little weird. Like, oh, you did the worst thing you can possibly do? Okay, we'll stay there around all of the children. We'll be back. It's really, really weird. It's stupid. Now, once you actually get access to the killing curse, it's clear why they wait to give you access to it until the end of the game, basically right before the final mission. And it's because it's exactly what it sounds like. It will one-shot kill any and all enemies, whether they are bosses, infamous level trolls, or tiny toads, and it will do it with ease. The one exception, of course, being with bosses that have multiple health bars. If you use Avada Kedavra on a boss, it will take out the first health bar, as in the case with Rookwood, but it will not actually clear both of them. So if it's a multi-phase fight, it will only clear one phase. It's balanced slightly by having the slowest cooldown timer of any spell or charm in the game, but that hardly diminishes its usefulness. Almost certainly, players will be saving it for the most difficult enemies in a given encounter, which is something that the developers leaned into because in many of the late game encounters, there were one or two elite class enemies sprinkled in with a handful of grunts. A great example is the fight at the end of the Sebastian questline with Solomon. If there's an encounter like this, you will simply use Avada Kedavra on the elite enemy and then clean up all of the underlings with your usual loadout. Though, of course, in the fight with Solomon, you don't have Avada Kedavra yet because you unlock that right after Solomon dies, at least in theory, if you get the dialogue prompt right, unlike me. Furthermore, you can chain these attacks together. If you curse an enemy, you can also unlock through the talent system the ability to use Avada Kedavra to kill any cursed enemy that's currently cursed at that time. Again, remember the default time for somebody to remain cursed is 20 seconds. However, you can unlock later the ability to up that to 40 seconds with a trait equipped to one of your clothing items. And as you unlock more and more talents related to the dark arts tree, you'll be able to chain multiple attacks like Flipendo, for example, which also can curse enemies. So before you know it, you can have an entire arena filled with cursed enemies and kill them all in one go with a single blow of Avada Kedavra. There is no doubt this is an extremely powerful weapon to use in combat, and I'm sure there will be many who claim it is overpowered. To which I would simply say, no duh. It's literally the unforgivable killing curse. Of course it's overpowered. How do you make the killing curse that's unforgivable underpowered? Like, I would love to know how you do that. It's thematically the point of this. There's a reason it's called unforgivable and why it constitutes a one-way ticket to Azkaban if used. It doesn't matter if you're some random grunt, a villain tied to the game's main narrative, or a beloved character from the original series of books. Anybody and everybody is susceptible to this thing. From the player's perspective, the choice to use these forbidden and cursed spells is one that may be taken extremely seriously or might be made without much consideration at all. I have been surprised, however, that most of the people I've spoken to in my friend group who have played this game Turns out they took this decision very, very seriously. Some were very worried about long-term story consequences if they were to learn how to use Avada Kedavra, Crucio, or Imperio, and others just simply didn't want to break their immersion by using something in gameplay that is so frowned upon in this world. I'll discuss the potential narrative consequences for using this in just a moment, because I certainly was expecting some serious consequences for using this so casually as I did, but like I said, we'll get to that in just a minute. As for the breaking of immersion, I think it's a real testament to how well they've recreated the Wizarding world in this game. While I don't find it quite as magical as the world presented in the films or in the books, I do think they've done a remarkable job. That certainly is a high bar to live up to. And in terms of balance, the fact that it's only accessible at the very end of the game after level 28 is reached and just before the final mission, I think it keeps it as a fun experimental tool for players that many will actively choose not to use. By level 28, you are extremely familiar with the combat system and probably already have your favorite loadout of spells and charms to deploy in combat. While something like Avada Kedavra is certainly handy in some situations, a lot of players will understand that it's something to be treated as a last resort. I don't have any data to back this up, but I would guess, based on my anecdotal conversations with a lot of you on our stream and in our Discord, that the overwhelming majority of people who gained access to Avada Kedavra probably didn't use it in the final series of missions, but rather only on side quests or while exploring the world, when the stakes were much lower and when people weren't expected to maintain their same level of roleplay. I think it's also worth noting that the final boss fight against Ranrock and his dragon variant don't allow you to use Avada Kedavra, and instead use all sorts of different spells to break the shields, which allow you to then deal damage. So there's no way to actually cheese that final boss fight if you choose to use this unforgivable spell you just unlocked. Honestly, all told, I don't really have a lot of notes on this. I think they implemented Avada Kedavra well, at least as well as you could expect them to. It's late in the game, has a long cooldown, so it can't be spammed to completely break the combat system, and it lives up to the expectations for it that players will have had after hearing so much about it throughout the game and from the books and films. And if players really want to have fun with this thing, as I mentioned, they can use those curses and chain attacks with Avada Kedavra together to totally wipe out entire rooms worth of enemies. It reminded me of those abilities like in Batman Arkham City, where if you down multiple enemies and stun them, you can then eventually unlock a finisher, which throws batarangs, clearing out anybody who's on the ground, which if you're really good, like I was back in the day, you can actually incapacitate like 12 enemies all at the same time with a single finisher, which is awesome. Sure, you can say, it kind of breaks the whole immersion thing, or it makes it so combat's too easy or something, but honestly, if the player has to work for something that ends up being extremely powerful, I'm okay with it. It's when something is super OP without much effort that there's a real problem. If I see somebody playing Elden Ring and they have a build that they've spent 200 hours perfecting, and then like, look, it can one-shot this boss, I'm gonna be like, that's awesome and super cool. I'm not gonna be like, okay, so you're basically playing on an easy mode. Okay, what a wimp, what a pansy you are. No, they worked for it. They broke the game in this way, but they earned the right to break the game in that way. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Otherwise, what am I doing? So for me, the real question is whether or not the world actively responds properly, or whether or not the consequences for utilizing the unforgivable curses are even coherent. Now, personally, I predicted from the moment that we found out this game was going to contain the unforgivable curses as a gameplay element that they probably wouldn't have that much of an impact on the narrative, simply because of the nature of games like this. You see, adventure RPGs, such as Hogwarts Legacy, rarely want to cut the player off from further exploration after the initial credits roll. Instead, they want the player to reopen the gates to exploration and allow the player to make their own fun in whatever way they see fit. And when you pair this consideration with the mandatory consequences of choosing the unforgivable curses, which I'm sure you can figure out pretty easily considering they are called unforgivable, it simply doesn't make sense for the story to have significant consequences tied to the use of the unforgivable curses. In other words, it wouldn't make sense for the player to be sent to Azkaban as a result of using the unforgivable curses throughout the main campaign. They aren't trying to make a game like that. They aren't trying to have super serious consequences for every little thing you do. They're trying to make a fun game where you can role play as a wizard, and that's about it. They're not trying to do anything other than that, which is why they didn't make those consequences take place for you while they do take place for Sebastian. To be crystal clear, in the final gameplay sequence, I openly used Avada Kedavra multiple times to take out some of the larger trolls and enemies that I encountered. This was no doubt seen by Professor Fig, Professor Weasley, Professor Sharp, and probably all of the others. If anyone was taking this seriously, they would shriek in terror when they realized that a 5th-year student was casually using Avada Kedavra in front of them. Furthermore, I also used the other unforgivable curses in the hours leading up to this in front of many people who could have easily reported it to the ministry or other professors. No doubt, this would lead to immediate expulsion and probably conviction, leading to internment in Azkaban. Hell, in the original story, Harry almost gets in significantly more trouble for behavior that's far less severe than that. Simply as a pragmatic matter, I think the developers looked at this stark conflict between player agency and the lore of this universe, and they decided to shrug it off to allow players to make their own fun. And honestly, I know this might come as a surprise to many of you because I tend to take things like this really, really seriously, but I actually think this was the right call for this game. Fundamentally, Hogwarts Legacy is pop entertainment. And it's very important to understand that. It's sort of like the Marvel movies. They aren't really meant to make you ponder existence or the deep and nuanced elements of the human experience, but rather they are mostly designed to give the audience a quick escape that entertains them for the duration of its runtime. If you try to take it super seriously, you will probably end up somewhat disappointed because there just isn't that much meat on the bone. A similar analogy that I've used before when discussing games like Skyrim is that this is a junk food game. It's super satisfying and hits the spot better than anything else you could imagine for your hunger in that moment, but ultimately it fails to deliver any serious nutrition. But despite that, you are still glad that you ate it because you understood what you were getting. You won't be expecting to feel as though you've just eaten a steak after eating a bag of Skittles. You understand it's going to make you feel different, and as long as you understand that, you're going to be satisfied. In the same way, Hogwarts Legacy is not the kind of game that, in my opinion, should force extremely strict and arduous consequences on the player. Frankly, this isn't trying to be a serious RPG. It's simply trying to be a fun one. And to be fair, sometimes it's just fun to mess around without major consequences, or at least super, super serious ones. If the developers had been consistent with the lore and made it so if you use Avada Kedavra even once during the story campaign, you were carted off to Azkaban in the ending credits with a pop-up that told the player they had committed the unforgivable crime of using these curses and have thus lost their ability to engage in endgame content, I would have respected their chutzpah, but I don't think I would have considered it very fun had I reached that pop-up without adequate warning beforehand. And with the generalized tone throughout the rest of the game, I think it would feel extremely out of place to finish this epic journey and then wrap it up with the worst punishment in the wizarding world. All of this to say, I think they made the right choice, considering what kind of game they were trying to make. The reason I tend to argue for more serious consequences in RPGs is because when RPGs expect you to take the story super seriously, they should do the same. Asking this of a game like Kingdom Come Deliverance is, in my mind, much different than asking that standard be upheld in a game like Hogwarts Legacy. They are simply trying to do different things, and it's not fair to hold a game to a standard that it wasn't built to live up to. But now let's get into some random thoughts and wrap this whole thing up. I'm going to do one last costume change and drink some tea for my poor throat because I just did like a 5-hour live stream before this filming session. So I'm going to do that and I'll see you in just a moment. Woo! Smoke effect! Boom, there we go. Okay, let's close this out by talking about some of the cuts, things that I think were in the game or at least originally planned to be there, were eventually torn out, and things I hope to see in a sequel, which, fingers crossed, will bring most of these things back. The most obvious one is clearly Quidditch. Any game set within and around Hogwarts, you would think, would have Quidditch on its short list of things to include. And the fact that there's broom flight, multiple occasions where you meet members of the Quidditch team, and where you can see players practicing, really makes me think that this was originally intended to be within the game. Now, in a lot of the press interviews leading up to the game's launch, even going back about a year before the official launch in February of 2023, the game's directors were very, very clear. There was no Quidditch. They had talked about it and decided not to include it so they could focus on other things. And that seems to be the case. I know a lot of us were hoping secretly maybe it was going to be in the game and they just were kind of pretending that it wasn't, so it was going to be revealed that it actually was and it would surprise all of us. But it's clear they just had to make an executive decision as to where to allocate capital and time, and in this case they just decided it was better spent on world building, on side questing, on combat and those types of things, instead of building this whole separate game, or I guess I would say mini game, but it's not really a mini game, like it's a whole game on the side. And I think it's a fair call. There's been debates as to whether or not they're going to bring this in the form of like DLC or an expansion, or if they're doing a spin-off game. And honestly, I have no idea what they're doing. What I would say is that they would be freaking dumb not to put this in some sort of package and sell it to people. I know for a fact that almost everybody who played Hogwarts Legacy would buy a Quidditch game, even if it's a $20 smaller package on the side. They would put the money up if it meant that they could actually continue playing a version of this game, even if it's a spin-off title. I mean, hell, they released Quidditch World Cup back on the GameCube, and that thing sold like hotcakes. Fun fact, we actually tried Quidditch World Cup through an emulator on stream a couple of months back while we were getting ready for this game to come out. You know, I'm sure it was great at the time. And I think fans would definitely be served with a new game that uses the flying mechanics of Hogwarts Legacy and then build Quidditch around that. Maybe it's not the best fit for an expansion because people would expect cooperative gameplay and multiplayer, and if that's the case, put it in a $10 or $20 package. Even $30 I think a lot of people would still pay for, and then include those multiplayer elements and have it just be about Quidditch. Don't try to just meld it into the rest of the game. I mean, even if they did a free-to-play thing with cosmetics and everything, and they have like the wizarding loot boxes, I wouldn't be a fan of those loot boxes, but let's be completely honest, that thing would sell like crazy. So I'm confident eventually we'll get a Quidditch game or spin-off. It's just going to be a matter of time. I would guess a sequel to Hogwarts Legacy takes anywhere from 4 to 5 years to complete, which means that if they spend 2 years building out Quidditch, that could be a great interim title to release in, say, 2025, while we wait for Hogwarts Legacy 2 or whatever they call it in 2027, which I know it's a little disheartening to think of 2027 being the next time we get a game like this, but that's just the reality of modern game development. Now, as for other cuts and things that I think were probably initially in the design doc that were later cut, I would include the following: a morality system, a notoriety system, curfews with class schedules more akin to a game like Bully, and then this last one, which I just wrote in all caps, that says consequences. I mentioned this before, I'm really disappointed at how few consequences are actually in the story. Usually the extent of the options given to the player are be a nice guy or be kind of a sassy nice guy, and that's it. And even in the main story or side missions, when you have the opportunity to make some really drastic choices, it doesn't actually change anything. The outcome is exactly the same, such as in the case of the Graphorn, where you are prompted with a button to choose whether you want to kneel out of respect at the end of that mini boss fight, or if you want to attack it. I thought, okay, if I attack it, then that's just gonna kill it and I won't get it as a mount. Consequence, right? No. In fact, if you attack it, it just kind of stuns it, and then it kneels to you, and you hop on, and then you have the mount. And then if you choose to kneel, the Graphorn comes up to you, stops running, kneels, you hop on, and then it's a mount as well. It doesn't matter what you choose, even in these seemingly black and white, very, very clear and very, very different decisions. It just ends up converging on the same outcome every single time. And it starts to feel like this world is more stiff than you were initially led to believe. Like, I get it. This is a game in a franchise that has established lore, and they can't really shake that too much. I totally understand that, okay? However, if you're going to give players the option of making these dialogue decisions and doing these things that seemingly have consequence, it just feels bad from the player's perspective to be given that option and then to have it mean absolutely nothing every single time as you go through the game. And like I said, the most serious consequence in the game is probably whether or not you turn Sebastian in for using the unforgivable curses. And even then, it doesn't really affect anything. You don't get to see the consequence because he just kind of tells you, yeah, I'm being investigated, sucks to suck. And that's it. But it brings me all the way back to what this game was trying to be. This game was trying to be a fun, lighthearted romp in the Hogwarts hay. And in that sense, I think it's very successful. But because it presents itself at times as a more serious RPG, it leaves many players, including myself, kind of frustrated because we are playing it in the way that they presented it to us, which is more serious, when in reality, the entire time they were just trying to design it in this kind of fun, lighthearted way. Now, another thing I want to touch on is something I talked a lot about in the lead up to this game's launch. I was very, very skeptical, as many of you guys know, about this game, as I try to be with every game, because in a lot of cases, even titles which end up being utter disasters. If there's enough hype, those companies still turn massive profits. On stream yesterday, we were actually talking about how Cyberpunk 2077, which was horribly received at launch, it still made a profit, not revenue, profit, cash in their pocket of $500 million within the first 3 weeks. And that was when the game was falling apart. Everything was melting, and they still made a ton of money from it because the hype was so high that the demand basically didn't drop enough to really seriously affect sales. They still got away with it, basically. So one of my missions has been to try and calm people down off of that crazy hype so that they can evaluate things a little bit more critically. So if that happens again with a major title, they aren't burned, so that they don't waste their money. And then those big wigs off in some office somewhere, they don't get their fat multi-million-dollar bonus for screwing over their customers because the hype was so high and because people called it a game of their dreams and hyped everybody else up to the point where it didn't matter how bad the reviews were, it was always going to sell well. But the point of all of this is that skepticism is about not believing something until there's adequate, or rather sufficient, evidence to warrant belief in that claim. If you tell me that this game is worth buying at $70, I'm willing to be convinced that it's worth $70, but I need to see the evidence of that. Part of that could be reviews. Part of that could just be the overall impression I get from watching it. It could be the history of the studio, the pricing model, how they've structured all this, whether there's loot boxes, and all those other things come into that evaluation. And this is something everybody does with every game they're interested in. I just try to make it much more clear and break it out piece by piece so people can at least follow my train of logic. And in the case of a game like Hogwarts Legacy, there were some things that were concerning as far as I'm concerned. The collector's edition was absolute dog water, and I stand by that. I mean, even if they sent me one, I was joking that I would probably end up just throwing it away because it was just a plastic book that would take up a ton of space and had to be plugged in. Like, it just looked super stupid. Part of the collector's edition value was the cardboard box that it came in. If you don't believe me, look at this. This is the picture of the description of the collector's edition, and the cardboard box is listed as one of the items within it, which is just bad. I mean, can you imagine like if Apple started like describing what's in the iPhone box, and then in one of the descriptions of it, it says, and premium cardboard box that the iPhone comes in as one of the items that you're buying. It's a bad look. It's dumb. But in addition to all of that, they also had, of course, the Dark Arts pack, which were a series of cosmetics, and they had the Dark Arts Arena. And my view on this still stands. It sucks to have a feature or mechanic or area in the game that is locked behind a paywall on day one in a single player game. That just sucks. I don't care how short it is. I don't care how easy it is to get through. I don't care if it's an end game piece of content or an early game piece of content. I don't like this because it creates two tiers of players: those who have access to an extra $5-10 in order to pre-order the next tier of game, or those who are willing to buy the DLC after the fact to get access to it. I think that just blows. And I would like these things to be accessible to all players day one who are buying the game on day one. If you want to release this as a DLC after the fact for everybody, okay. I don't love that even still, because you built it before the game came out just to take it out and then sell it to us after the fact. But, you know, at the very least, then you're not creating two tiers of players on day one. What I will say is I went to the Dark Arts Arena, I experimented with it, and I am somewhat happy to report that there's only 8 minutes of content. It's actually remarkably lame. Basically, you fight a few waves of enemies. You're allowed to use the unforgivable curses without any fear of retribution or punishment. And once it's over, it's over. And that's it. I didn't find the challenge unique here. I didn't think that this was even particularly enjoyable. It was just a series of waves of basic enemies that you've seen before. So it wasn't even like you're fighting 5 trolls at once. It was really, really unremarkable. And it's over just about as quickly as it began. I could look at this one of two ways. It's either like really, really good because this thing that was cut out and then sold to people ends up being really, really lame. It reminds me of the extra mission that they sold to people who pre-ordered Assassin's Creed Origins. It was basically a quest inside one of the pyramids that you could do. And it ended up being, like, I kid you not, about 7 minutes long and just a total joke. So in one way, you could say it's actually a good thing because they're not cutting out anything of major substance to sell back to the players on day one, which you could say is good. You could also say this is just a super freaking lazy piece of DLC to try and squeeze some extra cash out from players. I guess it's up to you as to how you want to look at it. Glass half full, glass half empty. I'm just here to report it. I think it still sucks. I'm going to criticize Ubisoft when they do it. I'm going to criticize God of War when they do pre-order collectibles or pre-order exclusive cosmetics and stuff. At least they didn't cut out chunks of the game and gameplay elements to serve the player after the fact. But I'm going to be consistent, and if I'm going to criticize Ubisoft for doing it and EA for doing it, I've got to criticize these guys for doing it as well. And in the same vein, just once again to reiterate, I want to make it very clear, I think it freaking blows that PlayStation paid for an exclusive mission, which many people consider to be the best side quest in the entire game, because if you complete that side mission that only PlayStation players get access to, you get a shop in Hogsmeade, you get to complete a very spooky sort of horror-like quest line that's really unique, and there's nothing really like it elsewhere in the game. So I think it's a really cool quest line, and it just blows that that's something exclusive to one platform of players. I know some people have been like, well, it's only exclusive for a year. I mean, come on. Like, if we're making exceptions to that extent at this point, I don't know how to help you. Like, you're just special pleading at that point. You're making an exception. If Xbox were to do that, you'd be complaining. But when it comes to PlayStation, you're fine with it. It's just stupid partisan bull crap, and I hate it. In a weird way, I would almost have more respect for them if they just paid the $50, $100, $200, $300 million or whatever to get it to be an exclusive to PlayStation consoles and not allow it on Xbox. Maybe just PlayStation and PC, because at the very least then, okay, everybody on console gets the same experience. Everyone on PC gets the same experience. I can respect it. I don't love it, but I respect it. But doing this where it's just kind of like a weaselly way of implying that you have the exclusive because you have exclusive quests, and then they also paid for all of the marketing rights. So all of the trailers for Hogwarts Legacy had PlayStation 5, the logo at the bottom of the gameplay every time they showed it. All of the button prompts were with the PlayStation button prompts. And they do that so that the average consumer sees those trailers, sees PlayStation pop up, and just assume that that's a PlayStation exclusive, even though it's not. In a weird way, I gotta hand it to Jim Ryan, the current head of PlayStation, who I, let's just say, have strong feelings about. This is one kind of clever thing he did. Sean Layden, through his time running the PS4 generation, he just paid outright for exclusives, and they found a couple of really good games, paid a ton of money to have them exclusive, and that was that. But Jim Ryan's approach has been to just make people and sort of trick people into thinking that it's exclusive by buying exclusive marketing rights and by having exclusive quests where you can have trailers that go up where it shows like exclusive to PlayStation, this quest line. But people see that and think exclusive to PlayStation, the game, which is why a ton of people in chat when we were streaming this game thought that this was a console exclusive to PlayStation, even though it's not, just because of how Sony has paid for all of the marketing rights. All of this to say, I think if you're going to be against console exclusivity and exclusivity en masse in the gaming industry, you need to be consistent, and you need to be able to say, hey, it sucks when PlayStation does it with all of these games, and it also sucks when Microsoft tries to do it by buying out Activision Blizzard and ZeniMax. We just have to agree this sucks. But the moment that you go and you say, no, it's okay in this case because it's PlayStation doing something, and it's bad in this case because Xbox is trying to do it with Call of Duty, I don't take you seriously, okay? Be consistent and I'll respect you a little bit more, but this just sucks, and hopefully we can all agree that this is just lame. That a lot of people will play through Hogwarts Legacy looking for this quest and looking forward to it because maybe they saw a clip of it or their friends told them about it, only to realize they don't get to play it because they're on PC or Xbox. It just sucks. But now we come to the conclusion of this video. I am glad to be here for one, because this video has taken way longer to make than these critiques normally do. I don't know what the deal is with this process of doing it. The game is massive, and I think that's part of it, but I've really gotten caught sort of in development hell with this video, which is why we're kind of like, okay, let's wrap it up. Let's do this, because it's just getting frustrating at this point for me, so I'm sure it's frustrating for you guys on the audience side. But if I had to wrap all of this up, unscripted, just letting my thoughts and hair out as we discuss it, I would say that Hogwarts Legacy is a good game. It's not great. It's not amazing. It's not genre defying. It's not something I'm going to be pointing to as a standard in open world design or narrative design in years to come, but it does do a lot of things very, very well. And as far as a franchised, licensed game is concerned, this is a tremendous accomplishment. Games that take inspiration or take their lore and settings from established franchises almost always suck. And so to see one like this come along and still provide a very competent gameplay experience to players, I think is really, really impressive. And perhaps the most impressive thing it did is it made this game package, which initially sounded pretty daunting, they made it accessible to the average consumer, which is something that normally you only see happen with a few select games every year. Like last year, I think you could argue Elden Ring did it. We've seen it take place with games like, Red Dead Redemption 2. I would actually say the generalized indicator of this is if it gets a mention in South Park, you probably have done a good job of piercing sort of the public veil of broader pop culture influence. Like if they're talking about your game in South Park, you probably have breached that and you're doing pretty good. And I think Hogwarts Legacy is one of those games where it's being discussed by everybody, even people I know that are not gamers are bringing it up. I was in the lane, like checking out at our local, like small mom and pop grocery store here where I live, and one of the ladies in the checkout aisle mentioned something about needing to pick up a game after she got off work because we're making small chat, and it's like, oh, what game? Not letting it slip what I do for a living. And she's like, oh, that new Harry Potter game, I hear it's great and it's all my daughter talks about. I was like, oh yeah, no, it's really good. I can recommend it, really good. And that's something that's very, very rare, but I think it's a testament to not just how well received this game has been for the broader public. A lot of people have spent tons of time in this game, but it's also a testament to the power of the Harry Potter franchise. I mean, even now, just setting a game in this universe brings the base score up to like 7 or 8 out of 10, or the hype level up to like 8 out of 10 by default. Before you've even heard who's making the game, before you've heard anything specific about it, people are already super hyped because they've wanted games like these since they were children, and now they're actually getting it as young adults and adults. And that's why, I mean, in a lot of ways, Hogwarts Legacy came at the perfect time, because a lot of people who grew up with Harry Potter now are young adults who are working jobs and can actually afford to spend 60, 70 bucks on a new game on day one and play it and have a great time. And gaming, of course, is bigger than it ever has been. So there's more people interested in Harry Potter and gaming than ever before. So in a lot of ways, this came at the perfect time. And also the fact that it's a single player game that's not monetized out the ass from Warner Brothers is very, very impressive. And the fact that this was received this well, even without those things, I think is also a further testament. It is kind of bizarre because Warner Brothers also is the publisher behind Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, which is coming out presumably at some point this year if they don't delay it again. They just delayed it as of the time of like the scripting and writing of this video, but we'll see if they delay it further. Hopefully not. But that game is monetized out the ever-living ass and has a battle pass and all this stuff, even though it's coming from a studio that previously has only ever done super narrative stuff. So I was kind of braced for Hogwarts Legacy to have a shop and cosmetic items for sale and all of this, and maybe eventually they'll add those things in. But on day one, the fact that it didn't have all of that was really, really impressive. And my hope is that for the sequel, whenever that comes, they follow suit with this game. They take inspiration from Hogwarts Legacy and don't follow suit with Suicide Squad, because I think that game is probably not going to be received too very well. And I think the monetization is something that hopefully we all can agree is something that should be left behind. And I mean, the fact that this game is already looking to generate probably about $1 billion when all is said and done, I think that is a testament to how you don't need to cram cosmetics and microtransactions and loot boxes and NFTs and stuff in your game to have a financially powerful title, to have something that can generate a ton of money for your company. You just need to make a really good game in a topic and genre that people are interested in, and then be transparent with it and show it to people. That's one of the things that I was most impressed with Hogwarts Legacy before it came out, is that they were so transparent. They showed it all the time. They had multiple events where they had the developers sitting on the couches. They invited YouTubers out to sit with them, ask questions, play the game in the months leading up to launch. And that's something that's very, very rare. And it's awesome to see them take that approach, and hopefully in the coming years they take that approach with other games and other studios take that inspiration, because when you're that transparent with your title, I think a lot of people gain confidence in it and they're more sold on it. They're more likely to buy it day one, especially if the reviews are pretty good, because they're like, no, listen, they weren't trying to hide anything from me. They were real with me. They showed it to me day one. They showed it to me in the months leading up to it. I'm interested. I'm down for it. So hopefully that's something that becomes more of a staple moving forward. But to go back to the core content of the game, I think while there's a lot of stuff that I would tweak and change, while I think it's frustrating how the combat breaks towards the end, while I think it's frustrating that so much of the world design is repetitive, while I don't like how there's zero consequence and how you start as a student, but within a few hours you feel like you're not a student at all of those things are things that can be tweaked in a sequel. But despite all of that, this is still a pretty remarkable game, and it's one I'm very glad I spent as much time on it as I did. I really enjoyed it, and it's definitely one of my highlights for this year. And even with the length of this video being as stupid as it currently is, there's a lot that I still could have dug into and discussed in greater detail, but I think it just would be overly tedious. We could have gone through the minutia of each and every single quest line, of the lore and how it compares to the lore already established, what they tweaked in terms of lore to make all of this work. You know, we could go into all of that, but honestly, there's a lot more people out there more qualified to discuss it than I, so I will leave it to them to do that. But as for this video, hopefully you got some enjoyment or entertainment out of it. Fingers crossed. Hopefully it wasn't a total waste of time. For me, I have enjoyed digging into the nitty-gritty details of this game and of this world, and I'm really excited to see what they do next. And as always, I want to hear your thoughts on all of the stuff I didn't really delve into, on all the things that I repeated myself on incessantly, because that's always going to happen in these videos where I film them over multiple days. We try to trim out as much of the rambling and double talk as we can manage, but sometimes it's just inevitable. So thank you for putting up with all of that. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you think of the game, if you're sold, if you're not. And as always, if you have any thoughts on this that you want to communicate a little bit more directly, come over to the stream and say hi. Check out the link tree for all of that in the description box below, and join me. Come over, say hi. Who knows? I'm probably streaming whenever you're watching this video at some point. So come over, say hi. And if I'm not streaming right now, I probably will be in just a few hours. So yeah, come over, say hi. It'd be great. But with that, I'm going to call it there. Much love. Thank you for watching and chilling with me over the course of this. Stay safe out there. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Ring the bell and all of that good stuff. And I'll see you in the next one. Hugs and kisses. Bye-bye.